The emergency room fell completely silent, not because of the code blue on the monitor, not because of the gurney crashing through the double doors, because a wounded Navy SEALs combat dog, scarred, battle-hardened, classified as dangerously unstable by 3 different military handlers, had just snapped his leash and crossed the entire hospital lobby. He ignored the commander shouting his name, ignored the security guard who stepped forward, ignored every person in his path, and walked straight to the nurse nobody noticed. The Belgian Malinois lowered his head at her feet. Then she whispered one word, quiet enough that only the dog could hear it, and he sat down like he'd been waiting 7 years to find her. Before we go any further, if stories like this are what you came here for, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you the kind of cinematic stories that will keep you up at night. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. The morning at Cascade Ridge Veterans Medical Center started the same way it always did, badly. Margaret Ewan, the charge nurse, was already on her 3rd cup of coffee when the supply inventory came back wrong for the 2nd week running. 3 beds in the East Wing were occupied by patients who should have been transferred 2 days ago. The physician on call, Dr. Raymond Schultz, was 40 minutes late and had sent exactly 1 text message that said running behind with no further explanation. And the overnight staff had left the medication cart in the hallway again, which was a fire code violation and also just plain rude. Nora Callahan walked into all of it at 6:47 a.m. and didn't flinch. She picked up the supply discrepancy form on her way past the nurse's station, noted the 3 overflow patients without breaking stride, and parked the medication cart in its designated alcove before she'd even set down her bag. She did all of this without announcing it, without making a face, and without saying a word to anyone about it. That was how Nora worked. That was in fact how Nora existed inside Cascade Ridge, efficiently, quietly, and almost completely without notice. She was 38 years old, medium height, with dark hair she kept pulled back in a practical knot, and the kind of composed expression that some people read as calm and others read as cold. She had been working in the Veterans Unit for 4 years. Before that, there was a gap in her employment history that she listed simply as personal leave and that nobody had ever pushed her on because she was competent, punctual, and easy to schedule around holidays. She was, by every available measure, unremarkable. That was the point. The Veterans Unit at Cascade Ridge occupied the 2nd and 3rd floors of the main building. It handled post-surgical recovery, trauma rehabilitation, and an increasing caseload of patients dealing with what the hospital administration politely called adjustment challenges, and what the men and women on those floors called something else entirely, usually in language that wasn't approved for administrative memos. Nora liked the unit. She liked the patients, not in the performative way that some of the newer staff did, arriving with cheerful voices and slightly too much enthusiasm that patients saw through immediately. She liked them because they were straightforward. They said what they meant. They didn't waste time on pleasantries if they weren't feeling pleasant, and they had a particular radar for sincerity that made them excellent judges of character. They trusted Nora. She'd never fully understood why, and she'd never asked. She was checking the vitals on a patient named Garrett Odom, former Army, double below-knee amputee, currently 3 weeks post-revision surgery, and maintaining a running commentary on the failings of the hospital cafeteria when Margaret appeared in the doorway. "Nora, we've got a situation downstairs." Garrett looked up from his tray. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that isn't your business," Margaret said, not unkindly. Garrett pointed a fork at the doorway. "Everything in this building is my business. I'm bored and I have opinions." "Odom," Nora said, "finish your breakfast." "It's not breakfast, it's punishment." "Finish your punishment." She set down the chart and followed Margaret into the hallway. Margaret kept her voice low as they moved toward the elevator. "There's a Navy commander downstairs with a canine transfer. The dog is a retired military working dog, Belgian Malinois, 8 years old, 3 combat deployments. The handler died 6 months ago. The commander has been trying to place him in a care facility for veterans with service animals for the past 4 months and getting turned down everywhere." "Why?" "Because the dog has been classified as psychologically unstable by every evaluating veterinarian who's looked at him. He's bitten 2 handlers, failed 2 behavioral assessments, and has a medical file that's apparently 3 inches thick." Margaret stopped at the elevator and pressed the button. Dr. Schultz approved the transfer last week without reading the full file. Now he's read it, and he wants to reverse it. He wants you to go down there and tell the commander that Cascade Ridge can't accommodate a dog with that kind of behavioral history. The elevator arrived. Nora stepped inside. Why me? Margaret gave her a look that communicated several things at once, most of them involving Dr. Schultz's limited willingness to deliver difficult news in person. Because you're good at it. And because the commander has apparently been standing in the lobby for 20 minutes and he's starting to make the front desk staff nervous. Nora pressed the button for the first floor. What's the dog's name? Kodiak. She didn't say anything else. Margaret watched the elevator doors close with the expression of someone who had just handed off a problem and was already thinking about the next one. The lobby of Cascade Ridge was a large institutional space with linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, and a series of framed photographs along one wall showing the hospital at various points in its history. It smelled like disinfectant and the particular kind of stale air that buildings accumulate when they've been running at capacity for too long. Commander Jesse Rafferty stood near the main entrance with his arms crossed, and the posture of a man who had been waiting longer than he was willing to accept. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of controlled expression that came from years of managing situations where showing frustration was a liability. Beside him, on a heavy-duty tactical leash, was Kodiak. The dog was larger than most Malinois Nora had encountered. Dense muscle, scarred muzzle, one ear that sat slightly lower than the other from old injury. He was standing very still with his attention fixed on the middle distance in the particular way of an animal that is processing too much input and managing it through rigid control. There was a cone of space around them that no one in the lobby had consciously created, but that everyone was maintaining. Nora walked toward them and watched the dog register her approach without moving. "Commander Rafferty," she said, "I'm Nora Callahan. I work in the Veterans Unit." Rafferty looked at her. It was the kind of look that evaluated quickly and didn't bother to be subtle about it. "You're the nurse they sent." "I am." "Where's the doctor?" "Dr. Schultz asked me to speak with you." Something moved behind Rafferty's eyes. Not quite anger, more like the recognition of a pattern he'd encountered before. "Right," he said. "Okay, so you're here to tell me the transfer's not happening." Nora looked at the dog. Kodiak had turned his head. He was looking at her. Not the alert, assessing look he'd been directing at the lobby. Something else. Something that took him out of his rigid stillness for just a moment. A fractional shift in his body weight, almost imperceptible. "Can I approach him?" she asked. Rafferty's eyebrows moved. "He's bitten 2 certified handlers in the last 3 months. I'd advise against it." "That wasn't what I asked." A pause. "You can try." Nora crouched down to the dog's level. Not fast, not performatively slow, just a deliberate, unhurried movement. She didn't reach out her hand, she didn't make any sounds. She just settled into that position and looked at him. Kodiak stared back. For about 4 seconds, nothing happened. Then the dog's nose dropped half an inch. A small thing, almost nothing. The beginning of a posture change. "His file says he's been in temporary boarding since January," Nora said, still watching the dog. "Since January," Rafferty confirmed. His voice had changed texture slightly. "And before that, he was with his handler for how long?" 6 years. 6 years. Nora kept her eyes on Kodiak. "He's not unstable. He's grieving." The silence that followed had a specific quality to it. "Dr. Schultz has concerns about liability," she said, standing back up. "I understand that, but I'd like to see the full behavioral assessment before we make any decisions. Can you give me an hour?" Rafferty looked at her for a long moment. "The last facility gave me 30 minutes before they walked me out." "I know. I read about that on the transfer intake form." She met his eyes. "I'm asking for an hour." "Oh." Dr. Raymond Schultz had the office of a man who wanted everyone who entered it to understand that he had achieved things. There were framed certificates on the wall, a medical school diploma in a heavy oak frame, 2 professional organization memberships displayed prominently, and a desk large enough to conduct a small military operation from. He was 53 years old, with the careful grooming of someone who considered his appearance part of his professional presentation. He had been the chief of clinical operations at Cascade Ridge for 6 years, which meant he had significant authority over care protocols, staffing decisions, and the kind of administrative procedures that determined how the hospital functioned on a day-to-day level. He did not, in Nora's experience, like being questioned. "The liability exposure alone should close this conversation," he said when Nora laid out the situation. He hadn't offered her a seat, which was a thing he did when he wanted to establish the terms of an interaction. She'd stopped registering it as an insult approximately 2 years ago. A dog with 2 documented bite incidents and a failed behavioral certification. The behavioral certification process involves a series of tests with unfamiliar handlers in unfamiliar environments, Nora said. Kodiak has spent the last 6 months in transit. The biting incidents both occurred during forced handling by people he'd never met in intake situations that would stress any working dog, let alone one that's Nora. He said her name the way some men said it, as a period, a full stop, a signal that the other person's portion of the conversation had concluded. "I approve this transfer based on incomplete information. I've now seen the complete file. The answer is no. I'd like to request a supervised evaluation period, 2 weeks. I'll take personal responsibility for the dog's interactions with, you're a nurse, not a veterinary behaviorist." "No, but I know working dogs." She kept her voice level. "And I know what trauma looks like in a patient who can't explain it in words." Schultz leaned back in his chair. "That's a poetic way of describing a liability risk." "The commander drove 14 hours to get here. This dog has been through 7 facilities in 6 months. If we turn him away, if we accept a dog that subsequently injures a patient or a staff member, I'll be the one standing in front of the board explaining why I thought poetry was a sound basis for a medical decision." He picked up a pen, which was the signal that the conversation was finished. "Tell Commander Rafferty that Cascade Ridge appreciates his service and his commitment to his canine's welfare, and that we'll be happy to provide a referral list of facilities better equipped to handle this case." Nora stood in the doorway for a moment. "You read the full file," she said. "Did you read the part about what Kodiak did during the Karabot extraction?" Schultz didn't look up from his desk. "That's not relevant to our liability assessment. He pulled 2 wounded operators out of a building that was actively on fire. He located a third one buried under 6 feet of collapsed structure. He held a perimeter alone for 40 minutes until extraction was possible." She paused. "He's not a liability risk. He's a decorated combat veteran with PTSD, which is, coincidentally, exactly the kind of patient this unit was designed to serve." The pen stopped moving. Schultz looked up. "2 weeks," he said, and his voice had a flat quality that meant he was recalculating. "Under a formal behavioral monitoring protocol. Any incident at all, and the dog goes." "Understood." "And Nora." He waited until she turned back. "This doesn't reflect a change in my position on the transfer. It reflects a 2-week evaluation. Don't confuse the two." She didn't bother agreeing. She just left. She found Commander Rafferty in the hospital's small exterior courtyard, sitting on a bench with Kodiak lying beside him. The dog's chin was resting on the commander's boot. It was the first time in 40 minutes that Kodiak had stopped scanning his environment. 2 weeks, Nora told him. Supervised behavioral monitoring. If everything goes well, we revisit the full transfer. Rafferty was quiet for a moment. What changed his mind? He made a calculation. About the dog? About the conversation. She sat down on the other end of the bench, not close enough to crowd, far enough to give Kodiak space to register her presence without pressure. Commander, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. All right? The file lists Kodiak's handler as Staff Sergeant Adrian Morse, killed in action 7 months ago. She watched the dog. But the file also shows a redaction in the section covering Kodiak's behavioral history prior to Sergeant Morse. There's a full 18 months that are just gone. Rafferty didn't say anything immediately. Why? She asked. Classified. I know it's classified. I'm asking why. He looked at her then. Really looked at her, the way people did when they were trying to figure out what question was actually being asked. Why does it matter to you? Because if I'm going to work with this dog for 2 weeks, I need to know what I'm actually working with. She held Rafferty's gaze. And because I've seen that redaction format before, it's not standard K9 records protocol. It's operational record suppression, which means whatever Kodiak was doing before Sergeant Morse, it wasn't routine patrol work. The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang twice and stopped. You know a lot about military records formatting for a hospital nurse, Rafferty said. I know a lot of things. She looked back at Kodiak. Do we have an agreement about the 2 weeks? We have an agreement. She nodded and started to stand. Miss Callahan. She stopped. The unit Kodiak served with before Morse. It was a special operations element. The mission files are sealed under a 7-year classification hold. Rafferty's voice was careful, measured. But the evaluating vet who did his first failed assessment wrote something in the margin of the behavioral report. Unofficial note. Said the dog kept responding to a secondary command protocol that wasn't in his training file. Commands no one on the evaluation team recognized. He paused. Like he'd been trained by someone else, someone who wasn't in any of the official records. Nora's hand rested on the back of the bench. Did they identify the protocol? She asked. Her voice was even, completely even. No. The note just said he kept orienting to the word granite, which wasn't in his file anywhere. They assumed it was a training artifact, something he'd picked up and associated randomly. Rafferty watched her. Does that mean anything to you? The courtyard was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then Nora said, I'll see you tomorrow morning for the intake assessment, 8 o'clock. She walked back toward the building entrance. She didn't look at the dog, but Kodiak had lifted his head from Rafferty's boot, and he was watching her walk away with the particular focused stillness of an animal that has just identified something it has been looking for a very long time. The next 6 days were ordinary in most ways that mattered. Nora worked her regular shifts. She managed her caseload, 14 patients, a mix of post-surgical and long-term recovery. She handled the medication discrepancies, the scheduling gaps, the 3 separate occasions when family members of patients needed to be spoken to carefully about prognoses that weren't going to improve. She did all of it with the same unhurried competence that had made her nearly invisible at Cascade Ridge for 4 years. And every morning at 8, she spent 40 minutes in the monitored evaluation space with Kodiak. The behavioral monitoring log, which she was required to submit to Dr. Schultz's office daily, showed steady but unremarkable progress. Reduction in environmental scanning, decreased startle response to hospital sounds, improved acceptance of proximity from unfamiliar staff. What the log didn't show was the other thing. The first time it happened was on day 2. Nora was crouched beside the dog, running through a standard desensitization exercise with a rolling cart, the kind of equipment sound that tended to spike his cortisol, when she murmured a correction to his posture under her breath. Not a command, just a quiet adjustment cue, the kind of thing you said without thinking when you'd been working with dogs long enough that it became reflexive. Kodiak went completely still. Not the tense stillness of a threat response. The alert, receptive stillness of a dog who had just heard something his nervous system recognized as language. His ears moved, both of them, forward, perfectly symmetrical. Nora stopped moving. For 3 seconds, neither of them did anything. Then Kodiak turned his head and looked at her directly. Not the peripheral scanning he used on everyone else, but a focused, deliberate look that had a quality she couldn't quite name. Recognition wasn't the right word. It was something more specific than recognition, something more like the verification of a conclusion he'd already reached. She went back to the exercise. She kept her voice completely neutral for the rest of the session. But she knew. She knew he knew. By day 4, Kodiak was walking beside her without the tactical leash when they moved through the corridor to the evaluation space. This was not in the behavioral monitoring protocol, which specified leash on at all times until week 2. She filed the log accurately and mentioned it to no one else. By day 6, he was sleeping outside the door of her office during her charting hours. The other staff noticed. Most of them said some version of "That's amazing, you have a gift." Margaret watched with an expression that had more questions in it than that. Rafferty, who came every other day to observe the sessions, said very little but watched everything. Dr. Schultz passed through the unit on day 5 for his weekly walkthrough and found Kodiak lying across the hallway outside Nora's office in a full relaxed sprawl. He stopped. He looked at the dog. He looked at the closed office door. He walked on without saying anything. That was the moment Nora knew the 2 weeks were going to become a problem. Not because they were going badly, because they were going too well. The call came on the morning of day 7. Nora was in the break room, which was really just a converted storage room with a microwave, a coffee maker, and 3 chairs that didn't match. She was eating a sandwich she'd made at 5 that morning and would not have time to finish, which was a standard feature of her Tuesday schedule. Her personal cell phone buzzed. Unknown number, Montana area code. She looked at it for a moment. She answered. Callahan. A male voice, clipped, professional. Not a voice she recognized. We need to talk about your employment history. Who is this? My name is Brandt. I work in a regulatory capacity I'm not going to specify on an unsecured line, but I need you to understand something. A pause, deliberately timed. The behavioral reports you've been filing on that dog are attracting attention. Specifically, the rate of his response improvement is outside what a civilian nurse with no documented canine handling experience should be producing. Nora set down her sandwich. Someone is asking questions, Brandt said, and the questions they're asking are getting close to records that were sealed for very specific reasons. I'm calling as a courtesy. What kind of courtesy? The kind that suggests you might want to consider whether this particular case is one you need to be personally involved in. There are other nurses. There are other facilities. This dog doesn't need to be your project. The break room was small and quiet. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear Garrett Odom arguing with someone about the television in the common room. I appreciate the call, Nora said. I'll keep it in mind. She hung up. She sat with her sandwich in the quiet of the small room for exactly 90 seconds. Then she finished her coffee, threw away what was left of the sandwich, and went back to work. Day 8 started with a transfer request. Not for Kodiak. For Nora. It was handled through the official scheduling system, which meant it had Dr. Schultz's authorization code attached to it. The request proposed reassigning Nora to the Outpatient Administrative Support Unit, a position that involved no patient contact, no clinical decision-making, and hours that didn't overlap with the Veterans Unit at all. The stated reason was operational restructuring. Margaret brought her the notice at 7:15 a.m. with an expression that communicated very clearly how she felt about it and that she was not in a position to say so out loud. It's effective next Monday, Margaret said. Nora read through it once. Did he give any other reason? He said the Veterans Unit is overstaffed for the current patient census. Margaret paused. We are not overstaffed. We are at 94% capacity. I know. Nora said, it's fine. She folded the notice and put it in her pocket. I'll go talk to him. She found Schultz in a meeting she wasn't supposed to interrupt, which she interrupted. He stepped into the hallway with the controlled irritation of someone who had expected this but not quite this fast. The transfer, she started, is a staffing decision, he said. It's within my authority. I'm not questioning your authority. I'm asking why. I gave the reason in the notice. You gave a reason. I'd like the actual one. He glanced down the hallway. No one within earshot. The dog's progress is generating paperwork that's going outside this hospital. I've received 2 calls in the last 48 hours from parties who are interested in the behavioral monitoring data. That is not the kind of attention this facility needs. What parties? That's not information I'm going to share with you. He met her eyes directly. What I'm going to tell you is that you have done nothing wrong, and the transfer is not a punitive action. It's a protective one. For the hospital. And for Kodiak? Schultz said nothing. If I'm transferred out of the Veterans Unit, she said, who takes over his monitoring? I'll identify someone appropriate. In the 4 years I've been here, how many staff members have successfully built a handling relationship with a dog classified as Nora? His voice was flat. Monday. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, all right. And she walked back toward this Veterans Unit. She didn't go straight there. She went to the courtyard first because Kodiak had morning exercise time at 7:30 and Rafferty was usually there. She found the commander sitting on the same bench as before. But he wasn't alone. A man she didn't recognize was standing beside him, tall, in civilian clothes that didn't sit quite right, the kind of fit that suggested they were worn by someone more accustomed to a uniform. They stopped talking when she appeared. Rafferty stood up. Miss Callahan. His voice had a different quality, careful, deliberate. You don't need my name, the man said to Nora directly. Not rude, just matter of fact. He had the eyes of someone who spent a lot of time watching rooms instead of participating in them. I came to see the dog. Kodiak was sitting beside Rafferty's leg. He'd been watching the man in the civilian clothes with a low-level, sustained attention that wasn't quite hostility, but wasn't far from it. When Nora stepped into the courtyard, Kodiak stood up. He walked directly to her, bypassing Rafferty, bypassing the stranger, without any hesitation whatsoever. He sat down at her left side with the precision of a dog executing a trained position. Heel, left side, perfectly square. It was a specific position, not something behavioral modification produced, something trained to a specific standard by a specific method. The stranger's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved between Nora and the dog with a focused attention that made the back of her neck feel cold. "He's made significant progress," Nora said, keeping her voice completely normal. "The monitoring log is filed daily if you'd like to review it." "I've read the logs," the man said. "That's not why I came." He paused. "Ms. Callahan, what's your background in canine handling?" "I don't have a documented background in canine handling. I work in veterans care." "Right." He looked at the dog. "That's an operationally specific position. Left side heel, square sit, no command given. I've seen that posture before, in dogs that came out of a particular training pipeline. It's not something that develops spontaneously." He looked back at her. "Any idea why he'd default to it with you?" The courtyard was very quiet. Kodiak pressed lightly against her left leg. "Dogs are complicated," Nora said. "So is trauma recovery." She reached down and rested her hand briefly on the dog's head. "If you'll excuse me, I have a shift starting." She walked back inside without looking back. Her hand pressed flat against her thigh as she moved through the corridor was completely steady. The rest of her was not. Because she knew exactly what that position meant. She knew which pipeline it came from. She knew the training standard it represented because she had been one of the people who helped develop it, in a place and time and operational context that was sealed under a classification hold and had nothing to do, officially, on paper, anywhere in any accessible record, with a hospital nurse named Nora Callahan. But Kodiak remembered, and the man in the courtyard was starting to understand why. She got through the rest of her shift on routine and muscle memory. That was the only honest way to describe it. The clinical work, vitals, wound checks, the medication reconciliation for a patient named Terrence Bold, who kept insisting his prescriptions had been changed without his consent and was, for once, actually correct. All of it happened at the same competent, unhurried pace it always did. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't change. She answered questions when asked and asked questions when necessary, and gave no indication to anyone on the floor that something had shifted in a fundamental way during a 7-minute conversation in a courtyard with a man whose name she still didn't know. She was good at that. She had been good at it for a long time. But underneath the routine, something was moving. Something she'd spent 4 years compressing into a very small, very dense space had started expanding again the moment Kodiak sat down at her left heel with that perfect square position, and the expansion had its own momentum now. She could feel it the way you felt pressure changing before a storm. Not the storm itself, not yet, but the unmistakable signal that the weather was about to become a different kind of problem. At 4:15, she went to file her end-of-shift notes and found Margaret waiting outside the charting room. "The man from the courtyard," Margaret said, keeping her voice low. "He was asking questions at the front desk." "What kind of questions?" "About your employment application, specifically your references and your prior work history." Margaret's expression was careful, measured. She was delivering information, not opinion, but the opinion was visible underneath. Quan at the desk said he identified himself as being from a federal oversight office. She's not sure which one. Nora kept her face neutral. "What did Quan tell him?" "That employment records are HR's domain, and she'd need to refer him there." Margaret paused. "HR was already gone for the day." "All right." "Nora." Margaret put her hand briefly on Nora's arm. A rare gesture, because Margaret was not physically demonstrative, and both of them knew it. "What's going on?" The charting room was empty. The hallway was quiet at this end of the floor. Nora stood with Margaret's hand on her arm and considered, for exactly 1 moment, telling her the truth. The moment passed. "I think the dog's progress is making some people uncomfortable," she said. It was true as far as it went. "It'll sort itself out." Margaret looked at her for a beat longer than the answer warranted. Then she let go and stepped back. "Your transfer notice is already in the system. Monday. I can't block it. It's above my authorization level." "I know." If you wanted to contest it, the process takes at least 3 weeks. That would give you— I'm not going to contest it, Nora said. She said it without particular emotion, just the flat delivery of a decision already made. It's fine. Margaret left. Nora went into the charting room and filed her notes, methodical and accurate, every item time-stamped correctly. Then she sat at the empty desk for 4 minutes and thought about a burned building in a place she was not supposed to have been. The building had been a communications hub. That was the official designation. In practical terms, it was a 3-story concrete structure in a narrow street in a city whose name she was not going to think about here. In a hospital, under fluorescent lights, with her name on a transfer notice, a structure that had been on fire from the 2nd floor up when the extraction became non-viable and the order came through to hold position. She had not held position. That was the core of it. That was what everything else had grown from, like a fault line that nobody put on the official map, but that determined the shape of everything above it. She had not held position because there were 3 people still inside, 2 of them mobile and 1 of them not, and the extraction timeline made holding position equivalent to leaving them to die in a building that had maybe 11 minutes before structural failure. So she'd gone in. She didn't think of it as brave. She thought of it as arithmetic. The options were hold position and watch 3 people die, or go in and have a reasonable probability of getting at least some of them out. She'd done the math and acted on it. What she hadn't anticipated was the part that came after. The part where the decision she'd made was quietly reclassified as an unauthorized deviation from operational protocol. The part where the people she'd pulled out of a burning building went home with their medals and their discharge papers. And she went home with a personnel record that had been methodically edited to remove her from the narrative entirely. Not punished, just erased. She understood afterward why it had been done that way. If the record showed what actually happened, it showed that the extraction order was premature, that the timeline assessment was wrong, and that a field medic with 2 years of combat deployment experience had better operational judgment in that specific moment than the officers who'd given the order to hold. Erasing her was cleaner than explaining her. She had accepted it. That was the thing she'd never been able to fully account for. She had accepted it, signed what they put in front of her, taken the separation package, and gone to Montana to become a hospital nurse. Because she was tired. Because she was 29 years old and had spent 7 years running toward things that were on fire, and she was tired all the way down to her marrow. Because the arithmetic of that one decision had cost her something she couldn't quantify in exchange for saving people who would go on and live their lives without knowing she existed. She'd made her peace with it, or she'd made something that functioned like peace from a distance. Then a Belgian Malinois had walked across a hospital lobby and sat down at her feet. She turned off the charting room light and went home. Rafferty called her at 7 the next morning. She was still in her car in the hospital parking lot. She'd arrived early out of a habit she couldn't break, and had been sitting there with the engine off, drinking gas station coffee that tasted approximately like warm cardboard. "The man from yesterday," Rafferty said. No introduction, no preamble. He'd apparently made the same decision she had, which was that they were past the stage of courtesy framing. His name is Aldrich Voss. He works for a federal investigative body that technically operates under a defense oversight mandate. Technically. He has broad authority to access personnel records, including classified ones, under the auspices of a program audit. A pause. The audit, as far as I can tell, is real. What it's actually auditing is a different question. What does that mean? It means someone filed a trigger inquiry, an anomaly flag in the classification hold on a set of sealed operational records. The flag gets filed when someone or something appears to be correlating with those records in an unexpected way. His voice was carefully neutral. Like, for example, a hospital nurse producing behavioral results with a classified K9 that fall outside any documented civilian training baseline. Nora set down the coffee. "How long has the inquiry been open?" she asked. 11 days. He paused again, and this time the pause had weight in it. "Nora, I need to ask you something directly." "All right. Were you attached to a special operations element before your nursing career?" The parking lot was quiet. A car pulled in 2 rows over. She watched a man in scrubs get out, adjust his bag on his shoulder, and walk toward the entrance without looking in her direction. "That's a complicated question," she said. "I know it is. I'm asking anyway." "I was attached to a medical support unit during 2 deployments," she said. "After that, I was separated from service." The nature of that separation is it's in the classified portion of my file, which you don't have access to. No, he said. I don't. A beat. But Voss might. She picked up the coffee again, didn't drink it. Is he coming back? He's still in Dearborn Falls, checked into a motel last night. Dearborn Falls was the nearest town with lodging, 12 miles from the hospital. He'll be back this morning. Okay? That's all you have to say? Okay? What would you like me to say, Commander? A long pause. I'd like you to tell me what's actually going on. Because I brought this dog here because I was trying to do right by him after 7 months of watching him fall apart, and I need to understand whether I've walked the two of you into something I didn't intend to. She thought about that. The directness of it, and the specific thing underneath the directness. Not self-interest, just a man who was trying to figure out if he'd caused harm and was willing to say so plainly. You didn't create this, she said. This was already there. Kodiak just accelerated the timeline. The timeline for what? I'm not sure yet. She got out of the car. I'll be in the evaluation space at 8. Are you coming? I'll be there. She hung up and walked toward the entrance, the cardboard coffee in one hand, and 4 years of careful invisibility beginning, with every step, to feel like something that was no longer entirely hers to maintain. Voss was already in the building when she arrived. She didn't see him immediately. She found out from the charge nurse on days, a soft-spoken man named Patrick Osei, who mentioned with careful casualness that someone from a federal office had been in Dr. Schultz's suite since 7:30. Patrick had the delivery of someone who had decided the information was relevant without being certain why, which meant he'd read the situation correctly without having all the pieces. Thanks, Nora said, and went to the evaluation space. Kodiak was already there. The overnight handler, a part-time staff member named Russell, who had been assigned after the first week as part of the monitoring protocol, had brought him in early, which meant Russell had picked up on the ambient shift in the building's atmosphere and responded to it by getting the dog somewhere contained before whatever was happening happened. Russell was 24, recently hired, and possessed of the specific kind of quiet perceptiveness that made him better at his job than his experience level suggested. He looked at Nora when she came in and said simply, "He's been pacing since 6. Okay, you can go. Is everything? Go get breakfast, Russell." She said it without bite. "You've been here since midnight." He went. Kodiak stopped pacing the moment the door closed and came to stand beside her, pressing lightly against her leg. She let him stay there while she read through the overnight notes, and when she set the clipboard down, she rested her hand on his head for a moment in the way she'd been doing for a week now. Not as a training gesture, just a human one, just the weight of contact. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I know." He leaned in slightly. She straightened up when the door opened. Rafferty came in first, and a half-step behind him was Voss. In the evaluation room's clinical lighting, he looked about what she expected. Mid-50s, trim, the particular economy of movement that people developed when they'd spent decades in environments where unnecessary motion was a liability. His eyes went to Kodiak first, then to Nora. "Miss Callahan," he said. "Mr. Voss." A beat. "You know my name." Commander Rafferty mentioned it. Rafferty had moved to the far side of the room and was watching both of them with an expression that had been carefully cleared of anything interpretable. "I'd like to have a direct conversation," Voss said, "if you're willing." "That depends on what direct means." "It means I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to ask you some questions, and I'd like you to answer them honestly." He clasped his hands in front of him. Not aggressive, just a settling gesture. "I'm not here to damage your career or create problems for this hospital. I'm here because a classification anomaly triggered a review, and the review has led to some things that need to be resolved." "What things?" "The operational record from a 2017 mission, designation Keystone Hollow, contains a personnel redaction. It's one of approximately 40 such redactions across that time frame, most of them routine. This one is not routine because the redacted individual appears, based on physical evidence and K9 behavioral correlation, to currently be employed as a civilian nurse in a veterans medical facility in Montana." He paused. "Which is not a thing that should be possible, because the redacted individual's separation paperwork indicates relocation out of the continental United States." The room was quiet. "Someone filed false relocation documentation," Nora said. "Yes." "Who?" That's one of the things I'm here to resolve. Voss looked at her steadily. The separation paperwork was processed by a records officer named Lieutenant Colonel Warren Galt, who has since retired, and who, as of 14 months ago, is the subject of a separate federal inquiry related to records manipulation across multiple classified files. Nora heard the shape of it before he finished the sentence. Galt. She knew that name. She'd signed papers in front of him. A desk, a government beige office, the flat light of fluorescence identical to these ones. And she'd been so exhausted and so hollowed out that she hadn't read every line. She'd trusted that what she was signing was what they said it was. What was in the relocation documentation? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was making a conscious effort and doing well at it. It designated you as a foreign national consultant who had returned to your country of origin following contract completion, which removed you from the domestic personnel tracking system. He paused. It also stripped your service record of the period between 2014 and 2017, which means any benefits, commendations, or formal recognition from that period are currently unattributed. The word commendations landed somewhere in her chest and did something she hadn't anticipated. She'd expected anger. What she felt instead was something older and more complicated. I was recommended for commendation? She asked. Voss reached into the folder he was carrying and removed a single sheet. He held it out to her. She took it. It was a recommendation form. The date was 2017. Her name, her actual name, Nora Callahan, not redacted, was in the subject line. The commendation being recommended was for actions during Keystone Hollow. The language was operational and formal, but the actions described were specific. Entry into a compromised structure under active threat, extraction of 3 personnel, establishment of a defensive perimeter during a 40-minute hold under hostile conditions. Below the narrative was a signature block. The recommending officer was Commander Jesse Rafferty. She looked up at him. Rafferty's jaw was tight. He was looking at the floor. I submitted that 6 weeks after we got home, he said. His voice was rough in a way it hadn't been before. I was told it had been processed and filed. I never received confirmation. I followed up twice and was told the record was under classification review. He finally looked at her. I didn't know it had been buried. It wasn't buried, Voss said carefully. It was processed by Galt's office and then misrouted, along with approximately 18 other commendation files from that operational period. Nora put the paper down on the evaluation table. Her hand was not completely steady. What happens now? She asked. Now I need your formal statement about the events of Keystone Hollow. I need verification of your identity as the individual named in the redacted record, and then the inquiry goes back to the review board with a complete file. Voss looked at her with an expression that she couldn't categorize neatly. Ms. Callahan, I want to be clear about something. What was done to your record was not sanctioned. The people who ordered the operational redaction may have had authority to do so, but the falsification of your relocation documentation, that was Galt acting outside his authority. It's criminal misuse of classified records processing. It's part of what's being prosecuted. Is Galt cooperating? He's cooperating with the parts that minimize his exposure, the parts that involve your file specifically. He's been less forthcoming about. A pause. Which suggests to the review board that there's something in your specific file that carries more weight than the others. Nora looked at Kodiak. The dog had been sitting beside her throughout this entire conversation, still and quiet, his attention moving between Voss and Rafferty with the measured observation of an animal that has learned to read rooms through survival necessity. Now he was looking at her. Keystone Hollow, she said. What was the official outcome listed in the record? Voss said, the official record lists the extraction as successful with 0 personnel casualties. It credits a coordinated team effort under the command of the ranking officer on site. He paused. It does not mention that the ranking officer had already called for extraction and that the successful 0 casualty outcome was the result of one individual disregarding that call and re-entering the building. Because that would mean the extraction call was premature. Yes. And premature extraction calls are what? Investigated? Referred? In cases where the outcome differential is significant, yes. The officer who gave that order would have faced a formal review. Voss's voice was very level. He retired 2 years later with full honors and a commendation of his own. The room was silent for a moment. Who was he? Rafferty asked. That information is still under classification hold, Voss said. It becomes relevant to the board's findings only if Miss Callahan provides a statement. Rafferty looked at Nora. His expression had something in it she hadn't seen from him before. Not pity, not exactly, but the specific look of someone confronting a wrong they were adjacent to and had not previously understood the full dimensions of. I'll give the statement, Nora said. Voss nodded. But not today, she said. I have a shift. I have patients who need coverage, and I'm already getting transferred out of this unit on Monday, which means the next 4 days are the last. She stopped, rephrased. I'll give the statement on Monday, before the transfer takes effect. That's acceptable. Voss picked up his folder. Ms. Callahan, I want to be clear about the timeline. The Galt prosecution is moving forward regardless of your statement. Your statement affects the remediation portion, what happens to your record, the unattributed commendation, any formal recognition that was wrongly withheld. I understand. There are people on the review board who want to make this right. He looked at her directly. I know that might not mean much from where you're standing. It means something, she said. I'll be there Monday. He left. Rafferty stayed. For a while, neither of them said anything. Kodiak pressed against Nora's leg, and she didn't move away from it. I should have done more, Rafferty said. When the confirmation didn't come through, I should have pushed harder. You were running a team, she said. You had other things. That's not an excuse. No, it's not. She looked at the door Voss had left through. But it's a reason. People get busy. They trust the system to work. The system failed, not you. The system was manipulated by specific people making specific choices, he said. That's not the same as the system failing. She almost smiled. You're right. It's not. He looked at Kodiak. He knew. From the first day, didn't he? Yes. Because you trained him. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I was part of the unit that trained him. Before Morse. Before the operation. I spent 14 months with that dog learning things together, and then I was erased from his paperwork the same way I was erased from everything else. She looked at the dog, who looked back at her with that specific, unwavering attention. But you can't erase what a dog knows. That's not how they work. Rafferty was quiet. He's been looking for me, she said. Every facility, every handler, every behavioral assessment. He wasn't failing, he was refusing, because he knew there was a right person somewhere, and none of those places had her. The room felt very small and very still. What happens to him now? Rafferty asked. After Monday. After the statement. I don't know yet. If Schultz transfers you, then we figure out the next step. She picked up the clipboard. One thing at a time. She went back to work. Sunday arrived with the particular quality of a day that knows something is ending. Nora worked her shift with the concentrated attention of someone filing things away. Not dramatically, not consciously, just the way the brain automatically catalogs the texture of things it knows it won't have for much longer. The particular sound the elevator made on the 3rd floor, the way Garrett Odom's room smelled like the cedar soap his daughter sent him, and that he used with such frequency it had become ambient. The angle of afternoon light through the east-facing window in the break room. She checked on Kodiak at noon. He was settled, calmer than she'd seen him since his arrival, though calm was relative and she didn't make the mistake of reading it as resolution. Healing wasn't linear. She knew that about people, and she knew it about dogs. She was charting at 3:15 when Patrick Osei knocked on the charting room door and said quietly, "There's something you should see. End of the hall." She followed him. At the far end of the 3rd floor corridor, outside the entrance to the veterans' common room, 4 of her patients were standing in the hallway. Garrett Odom, upright in his wheelchair, which he used when he wanted to move fast, and the prosthetics were slowing him down. Terrence Bold, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. A Marine named Sandra Vieck, who had been there for 6 weeks and rarely came out of her room. An Army Ranger named Del Pacheco, who had arrived 10 days ago and hadn't spoken more than 12 words to anyone. They were standing in a loose grouping that wasn't quite a formation but had the feeling of one. Nora stopped. "We heard about Monday," Garrett said. He said it without preamble, with the directness that had made him one of her favorite patients, and also, occasionally, her most exhausting one. "The transfer." "Word travels fast," she said. "We're veterans. Gossip is a survival skill." He looked at her with that particular sharp attention he deployed when he was being serious under the surface of not being serious. Is it true? Schultz is moving you to admin? It's a staffing decision. It's retaliation, Sandra said. She didn't say it loudly. She said it the way people said things they were certain of. Because of the dog, and whatever's happening with his records. I'm not in a position to We're not asking you to confirm it, Terrence said. We already know. Del Pacheco, who had barely spoken since arrival, said exactly 4 words. You shouldn't have to. The hallway was quiet. Nora looked at each of them. The specific faces of people who had been through things they couldn't explain to most people, and who had found, in this particular unit, a nurse who asked the right questions without asking too many, who adjusted things without making a production of adjusting them, who showed up and did the work and didn't need them to perform gratitude in exchange. I appreciate this, she said. She meant it precisely and without performance. I need you to go back to your rooms. Nora, Garrett started. I need you to trust me, she said. Okay? I know what I'm doing. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not agreement exactly, but the particular concession of someone who has decided to believe in someone else's plan even without having access to it. Monday morning, he said, whatever happens, you come find us first. She nodded. She went back to the charting room and sat down. The transfer notice was still in her bag. She took it out and looked at it for a moment. Raymond Schultz's authorization code in the bottom right corner. The clinical language of operational restructuring, doing the work of covering something considerably less clean. Her phone buzzed. Rafferty. Voss moved the statement to 7 a.m. Monday. Review board wants to be on call for the debrief. Are you okay with that? She typed back, yes. Then after a moment, tell him to come to the hospital. I'm not going to them. A pause. Then, understood. She put the phone down, the review board, the statement, the commendation that had been sitting in a misrouted file for 7 years, unattributed, collecting no weight in any record that bore her name. She thought about Galt behind his desk, the pen moving, her own exhausted, hollowed-out hand signing the bottom of a page she hadn't read carefully enough. She thought about the building that had been on fire. She thought about the arithmetic. Then she closed the charting app, filed her end-of-shift notes, picked up her bag, and walked the length of the corridor to the stairwell. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard it. A sound from the first floor. Not an alarm, not any of the standard emergency signals. Something lower and more human. Raised voices. Multiple, overlapping, in the particular register of the situation that had already moved past the point of normal intervention. She stopped on the landing. Through the stairwell door, muffled but clear enough, Dr. Schultz's voice, and another voice she recognized with a specific cold water shock of recognition, the voice of the man Voss had not yet named, the officer who had given the premature extraction call, the officer with full honors and a commendation and a clean retirement record. He was in the building. He was here. And from the sound of it, he was not here to cooperate with anyone's review board. She pushed through the stairwell door and moved fast. The first floor of Cascade Ridge at 4:30 on a Sunday had a particular quiet to it. The administrative offices closed, the main entrance staffed by a single security guard named Felix, who was 61 years old and whose primary qualifications for the job were reliability and the ability to stay awake for 12 hours. The clinical areas were running on reduced weekend staff. The lobby was nearly empty. Nearly. She came around the corner from the stairwell into the administrative corridor and stopped. The voices were coming from the small conference room adjacent to Schultz's suite, the one used for family meetings and difficult conversations, with a door that didn't quite seal at the bottom, which was why she could hear through it. She moved to the wall beside the door and stood still. Not your concern how I got here. The voice she didn't recognize. Male, 60s, the specific clipped authority of someone who had spent decades having rooms adjust to his presence when he entered. What is my concern is that a federal audit is about to produce documentation that names me in connection with an operational record I have been reliably informed was sealed. The audit is Voss's jurisdiction. Schultz's voice, tighter than usual, the careful precision of a man who was suddenly aware he was standing in something he hadn't anticipated. I don't have any authority over. You have authority over this hospital's HR records. You have authority over personnel files. And you have authority over what happens to the nurse currently employed in your veterans unit, whose presence here has apparently been enough to trigger a review that should never have been triggered. A pause. I moved to transfer her, Schultz said. I know you did. I'm asking you to accelerate it. Tonight. I want her off the active roster before Voss comes back tomorrow morning. That's not procedurally... Raymond. The voice dropped in a way that was more threatening for being quieter. I'm not asking you to do something complicated. I'm asking you to move a transfer date by 16 hours. You have the authority. Use it. Nora pressed her back against the wall. She was thinking, fast and cold. The man in that room was here because Voss's timeline had leaked, either through Galt's legal team, which was monitoring the inquiry, or through someone on the review board who shouldn't have been, or through any of the administrative pathways that classified investigations were supposed to be insulated from and frequently weren't. He was here because he understood that her statement, given tomorrow morning with the review board on call, would put his name into the official record in a way that the sealed file currently didn't. He was trying to remove her from the building before she could give it. What he didn't know, what she was currently calculating the implications of, was that terminating her employment or accelerating her transfer didn't actually prevent her from giving a statement. Voss wasn't bound by her employment status at Cascade Ridge. He could take her statement in the parking lot, which meant this wasn't about the statement. This was about something else. She moved away from the door and took the corridor to the left, toward the hospital's security office. Felix was at his desk with a cup of coffee and a crossword puzzle, which he put face down in the practiced way of someone who had long ago stopped being embarrassed about doing crosswords at work. He was a good man. She'd known him for 4 years, and he'd been dependably kind in the unhurried way of people who didn't feel the need to perform their decency. Felix, she said, keeping her voice normal. It's normal. Who checked in through main security after 4 o'clock? He frowned. Just one visitor. Came in about 20 minutes ago. Signed in to see Dr. Schultz. Said it was a personal matter. He turned the visitor log toward her. The name written there was R. Holt. Not a name she recognized. An alias, possibly, or a middle name, or simply a man who had learned a long time ago not to put his real name in places where it could be found. Did you see ID? Driver's license. Matched the name. She nodded. Can you pull the entrance camera footage from the last 30 minutes? Felix looked at her. He had the specific stillness of a man who could read that something was wrong without needing it explained to him. He'd worked security at a veterans hospital for 9 years. He'd seen more variations of wrong than most people encountered in a lifetime. Should I be calling someone? Not yet. Just pull the footage. He did. She stood at the monitor while he keyed back to 4:15 and she watched the main entrance. The man who came through at 4:22 was in his mid-60s. Well-dressed in the way of someone whose clothes were expensive and chosen to look unremarkable. He walked through the entrance with the ease of someone who moved through institutional spaces without registering them as obstacles. But his face. She'd never seen it before. She was certain of that. She had a good memory for faces. It had been trained into her and then reinforced through years of clinical work where reading faces was a diagnostic tool. She had never seen this specific face, but she knew his name. She knew it because it had been in a briefing document she'd read in 2016, 3 weeks before Keystone Hollow, in a context that had seemed routine at the time and that she'd filed in the back of her memory under chain of command, standard, and never revisited. Brigadier General Marcus Ellard, retired. Formerly the commanding officer of the operational element that had authorized, planned, and prematurely called the extraction on Keystone Hollow. He didn't look like what she'd imagined, in the abstract way she'd occasionally imagined him over 7 years. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked like a man who coached youth soccer and attended neighborhood association meetings, and whose worst quality was probably cutting in line at the grocery store. He looked like a man who had made a calculation about her life and executed it from behind a desk, and then gone home and slept fine. Thank you, Felix, she said. Lock the visitor log. Don't let anyone access it until tomorrow morning. Nora, I know. She was already moving. I'll explain everything tomorrow. Tonight I need you to trust me. She heard him exhale behind her. Not agreement, but the specific surrender of someone who has decided to extend credit on the basis of 4 years of demonstrated reliability. She went to find Rafferty. I was in the parking lot, which was where she'd told him to wait after he'd texted at 4 saying he was nearby. She found him leaning against his truck in the pale late afternoon light, and she told him in 60 seconds who was in the building, what she'd heard through the conference room door, and what she needed. Rafferty didn't say anything for a moment. He was doing the same thing she'd done, running the implications fast, calculating, landing on the same things she'd already landed on. He's trying to prevent the statement, Rafferty said. He's trying to prevent something. The statement alone won't do what he's worried about. Then what? The commendation file, she said. Voss told me it was misrouted, but misrouted files, when they're recovered, go back into the record with their original date stamps, which means if the file is formally reinstated, it predates Ellard's retirement honors by 2 years. A commendation filed in 2017 for actions that directly contradict the official account of Keystone Hollow. That doesn't just affect my record, it affects the accuracy of every citation in his retirement package. She looked at Rafferty. He's not here because he's worried about the audit. He's here because he's worried about the thing the audit will reopen. Rafferty's expression had gone flat, in the way of someone processing something that makes them angry and who is choosing to process it before acting on the anger. What do you need from me? Call Voss. Tonight. Tell him Ellard is in the building and that Schultz is being pressured to alter my employment status before morning. She paused. And tell him the statement isn't waiting until Monday. You want to give it now? I want to give it before Ellard has time to make any more phone calls. She glanced toward the entrance. How fast can Voss get here? He's 12 miles away. Rafferty already had his phone out. 20 minutes. Call him, he called. She stood in the parking lot and breathed the cold Montana air and did the things she'd been doing for 20 years in various configurations. Organized herself, settled her mind, prepared to walk into something that was going to be difficult. She was good at the preparation. She'd always been good at it. The difficulty was the part after, when the adrenaline settled and the cost of the thing became apparent. But she'd learned to push that reckoning down the timeline and deal with it when there was space. There was no space tonight. She pushed it anyway. Rafferty ended the call. Voss is on his way. He wants us to stay outside until he arrives. I'm not staying outside. Nora, Ellard is in there right now pressuring Schultz into doing something that affects my employment, my records, and my ability to give a statement to a federal investigator tomorrow morning. She looked at Rafferty steadily. I am a current employee of this hospital. I have every right to be in that building. He looked at her. Then he looked at the entrance. Then he put his phone in his pocket and said, I'm going in with you. You don't have to. I know. He moved toward the door. I'm doing it anyway. They found Schultz and Ellard still in the conference room. She didn't knock. She opened the door. The two men looked up with the particular expression of people who have been interrupted in the middle of something they expected to complete without interruption. Schultz's face went through 3 things rapidly. Surprise, calculation, something that might have been relief, in the specific way of a man who has been backed into a corner and has just been offered a reason to stop cooperating with the person who backed him. Ellard's face did one thing. He looked at her, and he knew immediately who she was. She saw it. The recognition, and beneath the recognition, a very controlled and very rapid assessment of the situation. Miss Callahan, Schultz said. Dr. Schultz. She came into the room, Rafferty behind her. She looked at Ellard. I don't think we've met formally. This is a private meeting, Ellard said. His voice was even, controlled. The voice she'd heard through the door, all that clipped authority, had been replaced by something more careful. He was recalibrating. This is a hospital conference room, she said. It doesn't belong to you. She pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm a nurse in the veterans unit of this hospital. 14 days ago, a K-9 transfer arrived that flagged a federal classification anomaly. The anomaly is connected to an operational record from 2017 that names you as the commanding officer who authorized a premature extraction call during Keystone Hollow. She kept her voice completely level. I was the field medic who disregarded that call and re-entered the building. I was subsequently erased from the record by a records officer who has since been charged with criminal misuse of classified documentation. Ellard said nothing. I'm scheduled to give a formal statement to the federal investigator on this case tomorrow morning, she said. You're here to prevent that. I'm here to visit a colleague, Ellard said. Marcus. Rafferty's voice, quiet, with something in it that cut. Don't. Ellard looked at Rafferty. Something moved in his expression, old, complicated, the specific thing that existed between people who had once been in the same structure of authority and have since ended up on different sides of a line they once shared. "Jesse," Ellard said, "you don't understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Rafferty said. "I submitted a commendation for this woman in 2017. I was told it had been processed. It wasn't. You retired with honors 2 years later based on an operational record that was only clean because her name had been removed from it." His voice was steady, but it had heat underneath. "That's what I understand." The room was quiet. Then Ellard made a mistake. He looked at Schultz and said, "Raymond, I need the room." Schultz hesitated. It was a fractional hesitation, maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough. In that 2 seconds, Nora could see him working through it. The request, its implications, what it would mean to comply versus what it would mean not to. Schultz was not a good man in the easy, uncomplicated sense of the phrase. He was ambitious and territorial, and he had moved Nora's transfer in a way that was bureaucratically clean and deliberately harmful. But he was not, she thought, a man who had fully understood what he was adjacent to. That understanding was visibly arriving now. "I think," Schultz said slowly, "that I should stay." Ellard looked at him. "This involves my hospital," Schultz said. "My personnel." He pulled out his own chair and sat down. "Whatever you need to say, you can say with everyone present." It was not a heroic moment. Schultz was protecting himself as much as anything else, distancing from something that was becoming obviously dangerous. But the effect of it was real, regardless of its motive. Ellard sat back. For the first time since she'd come into the room, Nora saw something shift in his posture. Not collapse, not concession, but the specific adjustment of a man who is revising his available options and not finding the revision favorable. "The extraction call was based on the information available at the time," he said. His voice had changed, flatter, more careful. "The structure's integrity assessment indicated—" "The assessment was wrong," Nora said. "I was inside the building. The structural failure on the north side hadn't propagated to the central core. There was 11 minutes of viable window remaining. I assessed it, I made the call, and I got 3 people out." She paused. "You know this. It's in the tactical debrief that Sergeant Morse filed, which is the document Galt's office was supposed to archive and instead suppressed." Ellard was quiet. "Morse filed a debrief," Rafferty said. He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of something. "I never saw it." "Because it contradicted the official record," Nora said. "It named me. It named the structural timeline. It named the basis for the extraction call and the reason the call was wrong." She looked at Ellard. "That's why Galt suppressed it. Not just because of my commendation, because the debrief, if entered into the record, would have required a formal review of your operational assessment." Ellard's jaw was tight. "Morse died 6 months ago," she said. She kept her voice even for this because it required evenness. "He can't verify the debrief, but the debrief still exists. Voss has it." The air in the room changed. "He has Morse's debrief?" Rafferty said. "He has it. He told me on Friday. He said there were documents recovered from Galt's records that were relevant to the remediation. I didn't know what he meant until right now." She was connecting it as she spoke, not performing certainty she didn't have, just following the line. "The debrief plus my statement plus the commendation file. That's the complete record. That's everything." Ellard stood up. "I'm leaving," he said. "You can leave," Nora said. "Voss will be here in approximately 12 minutes. He stopped. "He's not coming tomorrow morning," she said. "He's coming now. I called him when I was in the parking lot." She met Ellard's eyes. "You can leave if you want to, but the statement happens tonight." What followed was not dramatic in the ways that she'd have expected, before she understood how these things actually worked. Voss arrived at 4:53. He came in with 2 other people she hadn't seen before. A woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Deputy Counsel Rains, and a man who didn't introduce himself at all but carried a recording device and set it up on the conference room table with the efficiency of someone doing a job they'd done many times. Ellard had not left. She didn't know exactly why. Possibly because leaving would have been its own kind of statement. Possibly because Voss arriving made leaving feel like a different and more consequential action than it had been 3 minutes earlier. He stood near the window with his hands at his sides and watched the room fill. Schultz had called his hospital attorney at 4:40 and was on the phone in the corner in a conversation that involved a lot of yes and I understand and no actual content she could follow. Rafferty stood near the door. Kodiak was not in the room. He was upstairs in the evaluation space with the night attendant, which was the right place for him. But she was aware of him the way she'd been aware of him since day one, a specific steady weight in her peripheral awareness. Voss set his recorder next to the other one and looked at her. Ready? She thought about what ready meant. She thought about a burning building and the arithmetic of 3 lives in 11 minutes. She thought about a desk and a pen in her own exhausted hand. Yes, she said. The statement took 47 minutes. She gave it in the flat, sequential manner she'd been trained to use for operational reporting. Timeline first, then observation, then decision and rationale, then outcome. No embellishment. No emotion in the delivery. Not because she didn't have any, but because emotion in a formal statement was interference. What mattered was the sequence of events and the reasons for each decision within that sequence. She described the extraction call. She described her assessment of the structural timeline. She described the re-entry and what she found inside. The 2 mobile personnel and the one who required manual extraction, the fire's progression through the 2nd floor, the 40-minute hold that had felt like nothing she had a word for. She described coming out. She described the debrief with Galt's office. She described what she'd signed without reading. She described all of it without pausing and without revision. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Deputy Counsel Raines asked 3 clarifying questions, all procedural. Nora answered them. Voss reached into his folder and produced a document, which he slid across the table to her. It was Morse's tactical debrief. She read it. 4 pages, operational language, the specific, precise voice of a soldier filing a report about something that mattered. Her name was in it twice in the first page. Field Medic Callahan made the decision to re-enter on her own assessment. Her assessment was correct. The extraction call was premature by an estimated 9 to 13 minutes. She set it back down. That's consistent with my statement, she said. Yes, Voss said. It is. She looked at Ellard, who was still standing by the window. He was looking at the debrief on the table. Something in his face. She watched it. Not guilt exactly, not in any clean form she could name. Something older and more complicated, the specific expression of a man who has lived with a version of events for 7 years, and is now, for the first time, in a room where that version cannot hold its shape. General Ellard, Voss said, I need to inform you that based on this statement and the recovered documentary record, the review board will be formally recommending that your operational assessment of Keystone Hollow be submitted for review. The timeline discrepancy between your assessment and the recovered structural evaluation constitutes a material error in the official record. He paused. You are not required to say anything right now, but I would encourage you to consult your counsel before tomorrow morning. Ellard didn't say anything. Rafferty watched him from the door with an expression that wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter and harder to name. The face of someone watching an accounting happen that they'd believed, on some level, would never actually come. Schultz ended his phone call and sat down in one of the chairs. He looked diminished, not in a way that made her feel anything particular, but noticeably. The office, the certificates, the large desk upstairs that was supposed to communicate achieved things, all of it was failing to travel down here with him. He looked at Nora. The transfer, he said. I'll reverse it. She looked at him. Monday. I'll put from the system. Okay, she said. I didn't know what he was, Schultz said. He was clear. I knew he was pressuring me, but I didn't know the full... I know, she said. And she did know. She wasn't being kind, she was being accurate. Schultz had made a series of bad decisions in proximity to something he'd only partially understood. That was its own kind of culpable, but it was a different kind from Ellard's, and she was not interested in collapsing the distinction. Voss was still watching her. Miss Callahan, there's one more thing I need to tell you. She looked at him. The commendation file. When it's formally reinstated, it will carry its original date and the original recommending officer's signature. He paused. But there's a secondary notation in the file, from 2017. The recommending officer wrote a narrative justification in support of the commendation. He looked at Rafferty briefly, then back at her. It's thorough, and it has been sitting in a suppressed file for 7 years. The review board's position is that it should be read into the formal record. She said nothing for a moment. I'd like to see it, she said. Voss produced it. She read it standing up, which was how she'd received most things in her life that required composure. On her feet, weight even, chin level. Rafferty's handwriting was compact and precise, the handwriting of someone who'd learned to write legibly under conditions that didn't favor legibility. The narrative was 6 paragraphs. It described Keystone Hollow from his vantage point. The extraction call, the moment he'd realized she'd gone back in, the 40 minutes of not knowing, the moment she'd come out with all 3 of them. The last paragraph was 2 sentences. Field Medic Callahan's decision to re-enter was in direct violation of the extraction order and was also the only reason 3 members of my team are alive. I do not know how to reconcile those 2 facts, except to say that some decisions are only visible in their full truth from inside them, and she was the only one inside. She put the document down. Her throat was doing something she was managing. She managed it. Thank you, she said to Rafferty. She said it the way she said things she meant precisely and couldn't expand on. He nodded. Once. The room began the slow organizational process of winding down. Voss and Rains conferring quietly, the recording equipment being packed, the formal timestamp being attached to the statement. Schultz remained in his chair looking at the table. Ellard had moved toward the door at some point, and she registered his absence without noting when it happened. She was still standing when Voss looked up and said, "One more thing. I need you to understand that the formal remediation process, reinstating the record, the commendation, correcting the relocation documentation, it's going to take time. Weeks, possibly months. These things don't move quickly." I know. But the review board has already moved to freeze any action on your employment status pending the outcome, which means... He stopped. Because from somewhere above them, 3rd floor, she knew the building's sounds, came a sound that was not the hospital's normal register. An alarm. Not the fire alarm. Not the emergency broadcast. The specific rapid beeping of the medical monitoring system on the veterans unit. A patient alarm. Nora was moving before the second beep. She took the stairs because the elevator was slower and she was already going fast, and she hit the 3rd floor at a run and turned the corner and saw Patrick Osei in the corridor outside room 318 with his hand on the doorframe and a face that had gone to the particular controlled urgency of someone handling something real. "Bold," Patrick said. "Chest pain, diaphoresis. He's been symptomatic for about 4 minutes. I've called the on-call." She was already through the door. Terrence Bold was 56 years old, former Army, 6 weeks out from a hip replacement surgery that had been complicated by a pulmonary embolism in week 2. He was sitting up in bed with his hands gripping the bed rail and a gray-white tone to his face that she read in the first second as something worse than the hip. "Terrence," she said, calm, even, the voice she used when she needed a patient to focus. "Talk to me." "Chest," he said. His voice was tight and high in a way she hadn't heard from him before. He was a man who did not complain and whose complaint register was therefore reliable. "Started about maybe 20 minutes ago. I thought it was reflux." 20 minutes. She looked at his monitor, which Patrick had already rolled in. Heart rate elevated, oxygen saturation at 91% and dropping by the time she read it. She put her fingers on his wrist, pulse present but thready in a way she didn't like. "Did it get worse suddenly or gradually?" "Suddenly," he said. "Like 2 minutes ago it got bad. Before that it was just pressure. Sudden deterioration after a period of diffuse pressure in a post-PE patient. She was already running through it, PE recurrence versus new cardiac event versus the pulmonary hypertension that had been flagged in his records 3 weeks ago and that had not been followed up on with the imaging frequency it warranted. Patrick, I need oxygen now. Non-rebreather, 15 liters. And get Schultz up here. Not the on-call resident, Schultz specifically." "He's downstairs. I know where he is. Get him." She took Terrence's hand, not gently, not in the performed comfort way, just a firm grip that said, "I have you," in the specific language that people in real distress responded to better than words. "You're going to be okay," she said. "I need you to breathe slowly, in through your nose, out through your mouth. Don't talk." He nodded. His grip on the bed rail was white knuckle. She did not look at the door, but she heard it. Behind her, in this corridor, Kodiak. He was not supposed to be out of the evaluation space. He was not supposed to be on this floor unsupervised. But she heard his specific gait, the slightly uneven rhythm from the old injury to his right rear leg, and she heard him stop outside the door, and she heard him sit down. He was sitting outside the room, waiting. The way dogs waited when they understood that the person they were attached to was inside and needed to not be interrupted and would come out when the work was finished. Patrick came back with the oxygen. The on-call resident came 40 seconds after that. Young, competent, already running the differential she'd been running. Schultz arrived 2 minutes later, and he was, whatever else she thought of him, a genuinely skilled clinician when the situation required it. He looked at the monitor and looked at Terrence and looked at Nora. "What's your read?" he said. It was the most direct, unguarded thing he'd said to her in 4 years. "Recurrent PE or a cardiac event in the context of unresolved pulmonary hypertension," she said. He was symptomatic for 20 minutes before acute deterioration. Oxygen sats at 89 now. "We need imaging. We need him stable for transport first." Agreed. Schultz was already at the monitor, talking to the resident, moving in the efficient, overlapping way of experienced clinicians who didn't need to narrate their coordination. Nora stayed at Terrence's side. She kept her hand on his. She monitored his breathing, counted his pulse, watched his color. He looked at her once, in the middle of all of it, and said, very quietly, around the oxygen mask, "You're still here." "I'm still here," she said. "Stop talking." He almost smiled. It took 11 minutes to get him stable enough for transport to the cardiac imaging suite. 11 minutes that felt like a different shape of time than regular minutes, compressed and expanded simultaneously, the way high-stakes intervals always felt when you were inside them. When they moved him out, Schultz stopped beside her in the corridor. "Good catch," he said. He said it simply, without cushioning or qualification. A clinician giving credit to another clinician. She nodded. Then she looked down the corridor. Rafferty was standing at the far end, Voss beside him, and sitting between them on the linoleum floor, with the absolute stillness of an animal who has decided that this is where he belongs, was Kodiak. I was looking at her. She exhaled, and then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out. Unknown number. Different from the Brandt call, a number with a Washington, D.C. area code that she didn't recognize. She answered. The voice on the other end said, "Ms. Callahan, my name is Admiral Patricia Wren. I'm the chair of the Special Operations Medical Records Review Board." A pause. "I've been briefed on tonight's statement. I need you to know that we've been trying to find you for 3 years. Nora stood in the corridor of the veterans unit, Kodiak watching her from 20 feet away, Terrence Bold's monitors beeping steadily from the direction of imaging, and said, "Why 3 years?" "Because," the Admiral said, "the person who filed the original trigger inquiry, the one that started Voss's audit, wasn't a federal analyst." Nora waited. "It was a soldier," Admiral Wren said, "a staff sergeant. He filed it 8 months ago before he died. He spent the last year of his life trying to make sure we found you." The corridor was very quiet. "Morse," Nora said. "He left a letter with his attorney," the Admiral said, "with instructions to file the trigger inquiry if he didn't do it himself." She paused. "He also left something else, addressed to you specifically. We've been holding it pending your identification." She stayed on the phone for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Admiral Wren spoke in the measured, precise way of someone who had spent decades delivering information that carried weight and had learned to give it room to land rather than crowding it with explanation. She outlined the timeline of Morse's attorney contact, the mechanics of how the trigger inquiry had been filed posthumously, and the review board's process for holding the letter pending identification of the recipient. Nora listened. She asked 2 questions. She said she would arrange to receive the letter through Voss, and she said thank you, and she ended the call. Then she stood in the corridor for approximately 30 seconds doing nothing. Rafferty was still at the far end of the hall. He'd watched the phone call without moving, without asking. When she walked toward him, he read her face the way he'd been reading situations for 20 years. Not the surface of it, but the structure underneath. "Morse," he said. Not a question. "He filed the trigger inquiry before he died." She stopped beside him. Kodiak pressed against her left leg. "He spent the last year of his life making sure someone found me." Rafferty was quiet for a moment. His jaw worked once. He was a good man. Yes. Did you know him well? I knew him for 14 months, she said, before Keystone Hollow. He was Kodiak's first handler. She looked down at the dog. He would have known, when Kodiak was transferred out, that if the dog found me, it would trigger something. The behavioral anomaly, the canine records, the classification flag. She paused. He planned it, even the transfer. Rafferty looked at Kodiak. Something moved through his expression that she didn't try to name. He sent the dog to find you. He sent the dog to find me. The corridor was quiet except for the ambient sounds of the hospital running its night functions. Somewhere down the hall, Patrick Osei was updating a chart. Terrence Bold was in imaging, stable, being read by people who were competent. The rest of the unit was doing what units did at this hour, maintaining, enduring, getting through the night. Voss appeared from the stairwell. He'd been downstairs, she assumed, handling the formal close of the statement session. He looked at her face and did the same calculation Rafferty had done. You spoke with Admiral Wren, he said. You knew she was going to call. I knew she'd been trying to reach you for 3 years. I told her the statement was complete. He paused. The letter. I can have it transmitted securely tonight if you'd prefer not to wait. Tomorrow, she said. Not avoidance. She was making a decision about sequencing. Tonight had a specific weight to it already. She didn't need to add another layer before she'd processed what was already here. Tonight I want to know where Ellard is. Voss's expression shifted slightly. He left the building approximately 20 minutes ago. Is he contained? He's not under arrest, if that's what you're asking. The review board's findings won't move fast enough for... I'm not asking about arrest, she said. I'm asking whether he's in a position to make phone calls that damage anything between tonight and whenever the board moves. His counsel has been contacted. There are limitations being applied to what he can access in terms of official channels. Voss said it carefully, in the way of someone describing things that existed at the edge of what they could confirm. The review board moved faster tonight than I expected. The combination of Morse's letter, your statement, and Ellard's presence in this building. That convergence accelerated things. How much faster? The formal remediation recommendation is being drafted tonight. Not weeks, days. She absorbed that. And Galt? She asked. His prosecution is on a separate track, but the recovered documents from his office, including Morse's debrief, are now formally entered into evidence in both the criminal case and the board review. Voss looked at her steadily. Ms. Callahan, what was done to you was systematic. It involved at minimum 3 people making deliberate choices over an extended period. The board's position is that the remediation needs to be equally systematic, not just reinstating your record, formally documenting what was done and why it constitutes an abuse of classification authority. That documentation becomes public? Parts of it. The parts that can be declassified, yes. She thought about that. What public meant, in this specific context. Her name, in an official record, attached to something that had actually happened, after 7 years of the opposite. She'd spent so long compressing into invisibility that the prospect of the reverse had a specific physical quality. Not relief exactly, more like the sensation of a pressure change, something her body registered before her mind had caught up with how to feel about it. All right, she said, tomorrow. Voss nodded. He went back downstairs. Rafferty looked at her. Do you need anything tonight? No. Nora. I need to finish my shift notes, she said, and I need to check on Bold when imaging is done, and then I need to sleep. She looked at him. That's what I need. He almost said something else. Then he didn't. He understood, she thought, the particular thing she was communicating. Not dismissal, just the reality that the way she processed things was internal and sequential and didn't benefit from company at this specific stage of it. I'll be back in the morning, he said. I know. He left. She went to finish her notes. Terrence Bold came back from imaging at 9:15 with a confirmed diagnosis of recurrent subsegmental pulmonary embolism, smaller than his first, caught significantly earlier, with a considerably better prognosis than the alternative scenario in which he'd continued assuming it was reflux for another hour or 2. The on-call cardiologist adjusted his anticoagulation protocol and ordered a follow-up echo for Tuesday. He was awake when she looked in on him at 9:40. The oxygen was still running, but he'd pulled the mask down to his chin, which she let go without comment because he was at 95% saturation and his color was better and some things were not the hill. "You're supposed to be off shift," he said. "I'm finishing my notes." "That's what you said 2 hours ago." "My notes are very detailed." She checked his pulse. Still thready, but improved. "How's the pain?" 5 out of 10, which for me is basically nothing. For you, 5 out of 10 is an 11. She adjusted the flow on his oxygen. "I'm putting in a consult request for pulmonary follow-up that should have happened 3 weeks ago." Schultz's department dropped the ball on that one. Scheduling dropped the ball. I should have flagged it harder. She said it without particular self-flagellation. It was an accurate statement of a failure in the system that she had been part of. And accurate accounting was different from punishment. It's flagged now." Terrence was quiet for a moment. Then, "Patrick told me what happened downstairs. With the general." She looked up. "Gossip," he said, in the same dry register Garrett Odom used for everything. "Survival skill." "What did Patrick tell you?" "That there was some kind of federal thing happening, that a retired military officer showed up and tried to pressure Schultz about something connected to you." He looked at her with the direct, unvarnished attention of a man who had spent 30 years in institutional environments where the people who held power used it inconsistently and who had therefore developed a very precise radar for the difference between authority and its abuse. "And that you handled it." "It's being handled," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed, "but it's the accurate version." He was quiet again. Then, with the specific care of a man who didn't say things casually, "You deserve better than what this place gave you." She stopped moving. It was such a plain statement. No performance in it, no comfort-seeking. Just a man who had been watching her work for 6 weeks saying something he meant. "Go to sleep, Terrence," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do." She put the chart down. "So do I." She went home at 11. What? Monday arrived the way important days sometimes did, indistinguishable from ordinary ones at first light. The same gray Montana sky, the same gas station coffee, the same drive along the same road to the same parking lot. But the parking lot had 2 vehicles she didn't recognize, and when she walked into the building at 7:15, Felix looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who had been waiting for her specifically. "3 people have already asked for you," he said. 2 of them have federal ID. One of them is Dr. Schultz, which is unusual because he's never here before 8. "Thank you, Felix." Voss was in the small consultation room off the main corridor with Deputy Counsel Raines and a third person she hadn't met, a woman in her 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the specific bearing that senior officers didn't lose when they retired. She introduced herself as Colonel Dana Pruitt, retired, currently serving as the Review Board's civilian liaison. "The remediation recommendation was finalized at 4 this morning," Voss said. He slid a document across the table. "I need you to review it before it's formally submitted." She sat down and read it. It was 14 pages. She read all of it. The document was thorough in the way that official acknowledgement of wrongdoing needed to be thorough to mean anything. Specific, named, dated. It identified the redaction of her personnel record as unauthorized. It identified Golt's falsification of the relocation documentation as criminal. It formally reinstated the operational period from 2014 to 2017 in her service record. It attached the commendation with its original date. It attached Rafferty's narrative justification. It attached Morse's debrief. And at the bottom of page 11, in the section titled Accountability and Contributing Factors, it named Marcus Ellard by rank and position as the commanding officer whose premature extraction call had created the conditions for the subsequent record manipulation. Not as the person who ordered it, but as the person whose error the manipulation had been designed to conceal. She read that section twice. "This goes to the board today?" she asked. "Submitted this morning," Pruitt said, "pending your acknowledgement of the remediation terms." "What does acknowledgement mean exactly?" "It means you read it, and you confirm that the remediation as described is accurate and complete to the best of your knowledge." Pruitt's voice was measured and direct. "It doesn't mean you're releasing any claims. It doesn't mean you're approving of how this was handled. It's a factual confirmation." Nora read the last page again. The final paragraph contained a line she needed to read carefully. "The board recommends formal recognition of the actions described in the reinstated commendation file, to be administered through the appropriate service channel pending coordination with Ms. Callahan's current civilian status. Formal recognition, she said. What does that mean in practical terms? It means a ceremony, Pruitt said. If you want one. It's not mandatory. Some people in this situation prefer a quiet administrative correction. Some prefer the public acknowledgement. She paused. That's a decision you don't have to make today. Nora looked at the document. At her name, printed there, correctly, with the correct dates and the correct record attached to it. I'll acknowledge it, she said. She signed the acknowledgement form. Voss took it with the care of someone handling something that had taken 3 years to produce. Raines was already organizing the submission package. Pruitt stood up and said, Ms. Callahan, for what it's worth, this board has reviewed a significant number of records cases. The degree of systematic suppression in your file is not typical. It required sustained effort from multiple parties over multiple years. She paused. I want you to understand that we understand the weight of that. Thank you, Nora said. She said it simply because it was what the moment called for. Then she said, What's happening with Ellard? Pruitt and Voss exchanged a look that lasted about half a second. He was contacted by the board at 6 this morning, Voss said carefully. His counsel has been in communication with the review office since midnight. That's not an answer to my question. His retirement records are under formal review, Pruitt said. The commendations attached to his retirement package are being audited against the corrected operational record from Keystone Hollow. If the audit finds that his commendations were awarded based on an inaccurate account of that operation, they will, Nora said, then the board has the authority to recommend revocation. Pruitt's voice was neutral but precise. That process takes time, but it has been initiated. Nora nodded. She left the consultation room and went to find Schultz. I was in his office, which was the first time she'd been in it, in a position she hadn't had to create for herself. He'd left the door open, deliberately, she thought. It was a small signal, but she'd learned to read small signals from this particular man. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, which was accurate, and who was in the process of revising his understanding of several things simultaneously, which was also accurate. The transfer, she said. Already pulled from the system. He said it without preamble. At 6:30 this morning. Okay. Nora. He paused. He wasn't a man who found words for things easily when the things mattered. What I did? The transfer, the way I responded to pressure from Ellard. I want to be clear that I understand it was wrong. I know you do. That's it? What else do you want me to say? He looked at her. Something in his expression was genuinely uncertain. She didn't think she'd ever seen that on him before, not underneath the authority and the careful positioning. I expected more. I'm not interested in performing something for your benefit, she said. Not unkindly, just factually. You made bad decisions. You've reversed one of them. The others are going to have their own accounting. She looked at him steadily. The pulmonary follow-up consult I put in for Bold last night. I want it confirmed before end of day. A pause. Then, I'll confirm it personally. Thank you. She turned to go. The unit is better with you in it, Schultz said. She stopped. That's not something I said when I should have, he said. His voice had the specific flatness of a man forcing himself to stay in an uncomfortable territory. I want to say it now. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then say it to the scheduling committee, she said. When they review the staffing request for the veterans unit next quarter, say it there where it actually changes something. She left. The letter from Morse arrived via secure transmission at 10:15. Voss handed it to her in a sealed envelope with his name on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize. The attorney's, she assumed, not Morse's. Inside was a single folded page in a different hand entirely. She recognized his handwriting from the debrief, from 14 months of working notes and briefing documents, and the specific shorthand they'd developed between themselves for the training protocols. She sat in the small courtyard where she'd first seen Kodiak sit beside Rafferty's boot, and she read it. It was not a long letter. Morse had not been a man who wrote long letters. He was precise and economical with words, the way people were when they'd learned that the weight of a thing didn't require volume. He wrote about Kodiak first, about what the dog had meant to him, and what he'd seen in the dog's behavior in the months after Keystone Hollow, the refusal, the failed assessments, The thing that everyone called instability and that Morse had understood from the beginning was orientation. The dog was oriented to something, looking for something. I figured out what he was looking for about 2 years in, Morse wrote. I should have figured it out sooner. I'm sorry it took me that long. He wrote about filing the trigger inquiry, about the attorney and the instructions and the careful sequencing of it, the inquiry first, then the letter, then letting whatever the inquiry produced run its course. I don't know if this will find you, he wrote. I don't know if the dog will find you, or if the inquiry will, or if you've moved somewhere I can't trace. But I know that what happened to your record was wrong, and I know that I was a witness to part of it, and I didn't say anything at the time because I was 24 years old and I was scared and I thought the system would eventually correct itself. It didn't correct itself, so I'm trying to correct it. This is the only way I know how. I want you to know that I thought about you a lot over the years, not in a complicated way, just I thought about what it meant that you went back into that building, and I thought about what it meant that you were erased from the record of it, and I thought those two things together were one of the most wrong things I'd ever been close to. Take care of him. He's a good dog. He always knew you were out there somewhere. Morse. She folded the letter. She sat in the courtyard for a while with the paper in her hands and the cold morning air and the specific quality of a grief that had no clean location. Not for Morse, who she'd known for 14 months and not seen in 7 years, but for the version of the time in between where this letter had existed and she hadn't known about it. The years when Morse had been carrying this and she'd been in Montana being invisible. She heard Kodiak before she saw him. The uneven gait on the courtyard pavement. Russell had apparently let him out for his morning exercise and he'd come directly here, which was not protocol but was Kodiak, and she was past enforcing protocol on him for things that didn't matter. He came to her left side and sat down. Square, perfect, unbidden. She put her hand on his head. Yeah, she said quietly. He was a good person. The dog leaned in. She stayed there for 10 more minutes. Then she put the letter in her pocket and went back to work. The thing about accountability she had learned over the course of her life was that it rarely arrived in the form you expected. It didn't usually look like a single dramatic moment. It was more often a series of administrative consequences that accumulated into a weight heavier than any single event. Ellard's accounting had begun before she'd read Morse's letter, and it continued after. At 11 that morning, Rafferty called her from the parking lot. He'd spoken to a colleague at the Department of Defense, someone he trusted, someone who had their ear in the right channels. The review board's remediation submission had triggered a secondary inquiry into the operational record of Keystone Hollow, which meant the report that Ellard's retirement package had been built on was now officially under audit. They're looking at 6 other operations he commanded in the same period, Rafferty said. The question isn't just whether Keystone Hollow was misreported, it's whether there's a pattern. Is there? My contact thinks so. 3 of the 6 have documentation anomalies similar to the ones in your file. A pause. Galt processed records for all of them. She was at the nurse's station with a chart in her hand. She put the chart down. So Galt wasn't acting alone. Galt was acting as a service provider, Rafferty said. His voice was flat. To whoever needed records cleaned. She thought about the man she'd seen on Felix's security monitor. The expensive, unremarkable clothes, the ease of movement through institutional spaces. A man who had spent decades understanding exactly which levers moved, which mechanisms, and who had apparently used that knowledge with consistent, deliberate precision. The other cases, she said, are there other people like me? Other records that were suppressed? That's what the inquiry is looking at. Rafferty paused. Nora, there might be. The board's preliminary read is that Galt's records manipulation goes back further than 2017. She absorbed that. Who else knows about this? The board, Voss, and now you. He paused. They're going to want additional cooperation from you, not just your own case, your knowledge of Galt's processing procedures from the 2017 period. You interacted with his office directly. I know. Are you willing? Yes, she said, without hesitation, because there was none. She ended the call and looked at the nurse's station, the familiar surface of it, the organized disorder of a unit running at near capacity, the stack of charts that would need updating before end of shift, The sound of the elevator and the intercom and the ambient machinery of care. 4 years she'd stood at this station. 4 years of the particular invisibility she'd chosen, and then one Belgian Malinois had changed the geometry of everything. She picked up the chart she'd set down. Margaret appeared beside her with the expression that meant information. Board meeting. Schultz, the hospital administrator, and someone from the Federal Oversight Office. They've been in the administrator's conference room for 40 minutes. About what? About the hospital's obligations in relation to the federal review. Margaret paused. About Schultz's conduct specifically. Nora looked at her. The administrator is not, Margaret said carefully, happy. This was significant because the administrator, a woman named Gloria Taft who had run Cascade Ridge for 11 years, was not a person who expressed unhappiness casually or without intention. She was precise and institutional in the way of someone who had built a career on understanding exactly what liability looked like and how to keep her institution at a safe distance from it. Schultz's cooperation with Ellard, the transfer attempt, the HR record pressure, even the original 2-week evaluation restriction, all of it was now in a context that Taft would be calculating the implications of in very specific terms. Is he in there now? Nora asked. Has been since 9:30. She returned to her charts. At 12:40, Schultz emerged from the administrator's suite looking like a man who had been through something that had reorganized several of his assumptions. He walked to the veterans unit with the directional purpose of a person completing an assigned task rather than making a choice. He found Nora at the medication cart. I've been asked to inform you, he said, and his voice was careful in the specific way of someone delivering language that had been reviewed before delivery, that the hospital administration is formally documenting its support for the federal review process and its commitment to full cooperation. He paused. Additionally, the administrator is requesting that I formally withdraw any institutional resistance to your continued employment and full duties in the veterans unit. Is that what she asked you to do, or is that what she told you to do? A beat. Does it matter? No, she said. Not really. He stood there for a moment. Then, the consult for Bold has been confirmed. Pulmonary specialist is coming Tuesday. Thank you. He walked away. She watched him go. He would survive this. That was the honest assessment. He would survive it diminished, with the specific marks that this kind of thing left on an institution's memory of a person. He would not be removed. His clinical skills were real. His hospital needed him, and his culpability, while genuine, was adjacent to the central wrongdoing rather than constitutive of it. But the conference room had done something to his standing, and the something was permanent. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She'd spent some time, in the years of being invisible, imagining what accountability for the people adjacent to what had happened would look like. The reality of it was more complicated and less satisfying than the imagined version, the way reality usually was. What she felt mostly was tired. A specific bone-deep tiredness that was different from exhaustion, more like the feeling of a long tension finally releasing, which was its own kind of discomfort. She was charting at 3 when Garrett Odom appeared in the doorway of the charting room in his wheelchair with an expression that combined triumph, relief, and the specific satisfaction of someone who had been right about something and was choosing not to say so. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her. Don't, she said. I'm not doing anything. You're about to. I'm just sitting here in the doorway of a public room. He folded his arms. Sandra said the federal people left about an hour ago. Patrick said Schultz looked like he'd been turned inside out. Terrence is telling anyone who listened that you saved his life last night. He paused. I'm just saying. Go back to your room, Garrett. In a minute. He didn't move. You're staying. I'm staying. Something in his face settled. Good. He turned the wheelchair toward the corridor. The cafeteria soup is still criminal, by the way, in case that was a factor in your decision. It wasn't. Sure. He disappeared down the hall. She turned back to her chart. Rafferty found her at 4:30. He'd been in and out of the building most of the day, navigating the review board's requests for his own additional cooperation. And he looked like a man who had covered a significant amount of administrative ground in a short time and was running on the particular fuel that came from forward momentum on something that mattered. He sat down in the chair across from her charting desk without asking. Ellard's counsel contacted the board at 2 o'clock, he said. She looked up. He's not contesting the audit. His counsel's position is that he'll cooperate with the record review in exchange for consideration of his cooperation in the final accountability determination. He's cutting a deal. He's trying to. Rafferty's voice was even. The board's position is that cooperation is expected and doesn't constitute grounds for consideration. That's preliminary, but it means he doesn't get to negotiate the shape of his accounting. That's the current read. She set down her pen. What does that mean in practical terms? For his retirement, his record? The commendation revocation is almost certain. The formal review finding on the extraction call will go into his permanent operational record. Rafferty paused. His pension isn't touchable through this process. That's a separate mechanism. But his public record, his standing with the institutions he's been associated with since retirement, he stopped. There are 3 foundation board positions and a university advisory role. His counsel has already received inquiries from 2 of them. She understood. The official record would be corrected, but the secondary effects, the reputation, the affiliations, the professional standing that a retired general used to continue existing in certain worlds, those were already beginning to move. It's not enough, she said. Flat, honest. No, Rafferty said. It's not. He held her gaze. It's what's possible. She accepted that. Not with peace exactly, but with the specific recognition of a person who has done enough operational work to understand the difference between what should happen and what the available mechanisms can produce. Okay, she said. There's something else, he said. The board's recognition recommendation. Pruitt called me an hour ago. They've confirmed the channel for formal acknowledgement, and they want to proceed before the end of the week if you're agreeable. She looked at him. This week? They want to do it here, he said. At the hospital. The position of the board is that the location matters, that the recognition should happen in the place where you've been working, where you were almost pushed out. He paused. That's my read on their reasoning. Pruitt was more diplomatic about it. She was quiet. A ceremony. Here. In this building where she'd been invisible for 4 years, where her name had been on a transfer notice 48 hours ago, where she'd spent the better part of a decade compressing herself into a shape that didn't attract attention. Who would be there, she asked. The board's liaison. Voss. Me. He paused. Your patients, if you want them. The hospital staff. Another pause. It's your call. All of it. You can say no to the whole thing, and they do it administratively, quietly, and you get a letter in the mail. She thought about Morse's letter in her pocket. She thought about a left-side heel position on a linoleum floor. She thought about Garrett Odom in the doorway saying, "You're staying," with the specific relief of someone who had needed to know. Tell Pruitt yes, she said. This week. Rafferty nodded. He started to stand. Jesse. She said his first name without quite deciding to. He stopped. Thank you for the commendation in 2007. Even before, thank you. He looked at her for a moment. I should have pushed harder when it disappeared. You believed in a system that was supposed to work, she said. That's not the same as failing me. He stood up. He didn't argue with her, which was the right response. Friday morning, he said. I'll confirm with Pruitt. He left. She sat alone in the charting room for a moment. Then she pulled Morse's letter out of her pocket and read the last line again. He always knew you were out there somewhere. She folded it carefully and put it back. She had one more chart to finish. She picked up her pen. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. A number she didn't recognize. Not DC, not Montana. An area code she'd seen before, once, briefly, associated with a name that was supposed to be contained within a sealed record. She answered. The voice was male, older, and controlled in the way of someone forcing control over something that wanted to shake. Ms. Callahan, the voice said. My name is Theodore Galt. Her pen stopped moving. I know who you are, she said. Then you know why I'm calling. A pause. My attorney's position is that full cooperation with the board review is in my best interest. I've been advised to be transparent about my involvement in the record modifications. Another pause, longer this time, with something in it that wasn't quite hesitation, but was adjacent to it. There are things in those files that go beyond your case, things the board may not have found yet. She kept her voice completely even. What kind of things? The kind, Galt said slowly, that involves someone other than Ellard, Someone who was in a position to benefit from your erasure in a way that went beyond covering an extraction error. His voice was careful, calculated. Someone who is not yet named in any of the board's current documents. The charting room was very quiet. Who? She said. Galt took 3 seconds to answer. 3 seconds that had the specific texture of a man measuring risk against whatever had finally pushed him past the point of calculating it the way he used to. His name is Brigadier General Warren Fawcett, Galt said. Retired. He was Ellard's direct superior during the Keystone Hollow operational period. He wasn't on site. He wasn't in the chain of command for the extraction call, but he was in the chain of command for everything that happened after. Nora kept her pen still on the desk. He ordered the suppression. He authorized it, through me. He had the authority to direct records processing, and he used it, not for Keystone Hollow specifically, that was Ellard's problem. But when Ellard came to him after the fact, Fawcett made the decision to manage it institutionally. Because if Ellard's extraction call was formally reviewed and found to be premature, the question of who approved Ellard's operational authority for that mission becomes relevant, and that question leads to Fawcett. He was protecting himself. Ellard was protecting himself. Fawcett was protecting a system he'd spent 35 years building. Galt's voice was careful, precise, the voice of a man who had thought about how to say this for a long time. Fawcett has been on the Defense Appropriations Advisory Council for 4 years. He advises on special operations funding. His credibility in that role depends on a clean record. A pause. Your file wasn't the only one. There are 7 others I processed at his direction over 12 years. 7 others. She absorbed that number. What it meant in terms of scope, in terms of the systematic nature of it, in terms of the number of people sitting somewhere right now who were invisible in the same way she'd been invisible, carrying the same compressed weight of things that had happened and been officially unmade. Have you told the board about Fawcett? She asked. Not yet. My attorney is negotiating the terms of that disclosure. Another pause. I'm calling you because you have the board's attention right now in a way that I don't. The remediation on your file is already moving. If Fawcett's name enters the record through your cooperation rather than through my attorney's negotiation, it carries more weight. He said it plainly, without trying to make it sound like anything other than what it was. I'm asking you to bring it forward. You're asking me to do your work for you, she said. I'm asking you to do what you did in that building, he said, because apparently that's what you do. She sat with the phone in the quiet charting room and the weight of what he'd just handed her. Send everything you have to Voss, she said. Tonight. All of it. Fawcett, the 7 files, the authorization chain, whatever you have. She paused. If you're doing this because you want a deal, the board is going to know that. So don't waste time making it look like something else. I know. Send it tonight. She hung up. She sat for a moment. Then she called Voss. Voss was at his motel when she reached him. He listened to the summary without interrupting, asked 4 tightly focused questions, and said he would contact the board's senior investigator within the hour. His voice had the specific quality of someone who had suspected a larger architecture and was now receiving confirmation of it. Not satisfied exactly, more like the grim recognition of a scope that was larger and therefore heavier than what he'd been carrying. Fawcett, he said. I know that name from the council. He's still active in an advisory capacity. Yes. A pause. Ms. Callahan, this changes the timeline significantly. The remediation on your file is complete. That doesn't change. But the broader inquiry, with 7 additional files and a named senior figure, that's going to run longer and involve more people than what we've been doing. I understand. Your cooperation may be requested at additional points in that process. I'll cooperate. I know you will. He said it with a plainness that acknowledged something without naming it, the particular quality she'd demonstrated throughout this process, which was that she had never, at any point, tried to limit her involvement to what was strictly necessary for her own case. The ceremony on Friday, does this change your position on that? She thought about it. Fawcett being unnamed didn't change what she'd done. Fawcett existing didn't retroactively alter Keystone Hollow or what her record said about it, or what Morse had written in his letter. The ceremony was about her specific file, her specific actions, the specific wrong that had been done to her and was now being corrected. It doesn't change it, she said. Friday. Friday, Voss confirmed. She put the phone down and finished her chart. Tuesday and Wednesday moved in the particular way of days that are not the event but that exist in the event's gravity. The hospital ran. She worked. Terence Bold's pulmonary consult happened on Tuesday afternoon and produced a revised anticoagulation plan that was more aggressive and more appropriate than what he'd been on. And he complained about it in the specific way of patients who complain about correct treatment because they prefer the incorrect one they're used to. Kodiak stayed in the evaluation space at night and came to her in the mornings with the unhurried reliability of an animal who had resolved something internal and was now simply present in the resolution. He was calmer than he'd been on day one in a way that wasn't performance. It was structural, the way things became calm when the underlying tension finally had a name and an address. On Wednesday morning, Voss called to tell her that Galt's transmission had arrived and had been received by the board's senior investigator. The 7 additional files were real. 2 of them had already been cross-referenced to records in the board's existing database. Fawcett's name was now formally entered into the inquiry. She asked how long. Voss said months. Possibly longer. She said she understood. On Wednesday afternoon, Rafferty found her in the courtyard at the end of her shift. He sat on the bench and they didn't talk for a few minutes, which was comfortable in the way that silence was comfortable between people who had been through something together and didn't need to narrate it to each other. Pruitt confirmed the full board liaison team for Friday, he said eventually. Admiral Wren is flying in. She looked at him. The chair is coming in person? Apparently she felt it warranted it. I was quiet for a moment. There's going to be media. Not press conference level, but a board ceremony of this kind, with the scope of the remediation, the inquiry context. Someone is going to report on it. I know. Are you okay with that? She considered the question honestly. What okay meant here in this specific configuration? A year ago? A month ago? The answer would have been no, immediately and without qualification. The invisibility she'd maintained had been deliberate, protective, built around the understanding that exposure was risk, and risk was something she'd had enough of. But the invisibility hadn't actually protected her. It had just deferred the thing that was going to arrive anyway, whenever a dog with a good memory came through the right door. I'm okay with it, she said. He nodded. How are you? She asked. He looked at her sideways. That's the first time you've asked me that. I've been occupied. Fair. He was quiet for a moment. I'm working through some things, the commendation, knowing it was sitting in a suppressed file for 7 years. He paused. I trusted the wrong system. Yes. That's a hard thing to sit with. I know. She looked at the sky over the courtyard, the particular shade of Montana late afternoon that was almost impossible to describe to people who hadn't seen it. You also wrote 6 paragraphs for a woman you'd spent 14 months working with and then thought you'd never see again. You did that and then you let it go because you trusted the system to carry it. It didn't carry it. No. But you did the right thing and the wrong thing happened afterward, and those are 2 separate facts. She looked at him. That's also hard to sit with, but they're separate. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when did you get so philosophical? 4 years of veterans' care, she said. You develop a perspective. He almost smiled. Thursday brought news that wasn't in the official channels. Sandra Vieck, who rarely left her room and who had said approximately 40 words to Nora in 6 weeks, and who had a sister who worked in civilian contracting adjacent to defense procurement, came to the nurses' station at 2 in the afternoon and said quietly, Fawcett resigned from the council this morning. Nora looked up. My sister saw the internal notice, Sandra said. Her voice was flat and factual. She delivered information the way she did everything, without excess. It said health reasons. It said effective immediately. She paused. My sister said she's never seen a resignation move that fast. Thank you, Sandra. Sandra nodded and went back to her room. Nora stood at the nurses' station and let that information settle. Fawcett resigning didn't resolve the inquiry. It didn't address the 7 files or the people in those files or the institutional machinery that had made his choices possible. A resignation was not accountability, it was exit. It was a man removing himself from a position before the position was removed from him, which was its own kind of telling. But it was movement. It was the system beginning to register the weight of what had been placed on it, and the sound of that registration, even muffled and preliminary, had a quality she hadn't expected. She called Voss. He already knew. "The council was informed this morning," he said. "The inquiry isn't contingent on his council status, but his council likely advised the resignation to limit ongoing exposure." A pause. "It won't help him." "Good," she said. She meant it without anger, which surprised her. She'd expected to feel more when this started to move, more heat in it. What she felt instead was something quieter, the particular satisfaction of a thing being corrected that doesn't erase what was wrong but does insist on naming it. That was what accountability actually looked like, she thought, from inside it. Not catharsis, just correction. She went back to work. Friday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of Montana morning that had a crystalline quality to the light, everything defined sharply against everything else. She got to the hospital at 6:30, earlier than she needed to. She walked the unit in the quiet of the early shift, checking the overnight notes, talking briefly with the night staff about the patients who'd had difficult nights and the ones who'd rested well. Terrence Bold was improving by every measurable standard. Garrett Odom was scheduled for an outpatient physical therapy consultation that he was preemptively complaining about. Del Pacheco had started talking. Not a lot, not in full sentences, but something had unlocked in the last week and he was making eye contact, which was its own kind of progress. At 7:15, she went to the evaluation space and sat with Kodiak for 30 minutes, not as a training session, not as a monitoring protocol, just the two of them in the quiet space with the morning light coming through the high window and the hospital beginning its day around them. She thought about Morse. She thought about the 14 months of working beside him, the specific, unglamorous reality of it. The cold briefing rooms and the difficult procedures and the arguments they'd had about protocol and the trust that had accumulated through all of it, the way trust actually accumulated, which was slowly and through the accumulation of small, accurate things rather than any single dramatic one. She thought about him filing that trigger inquiry with the careful sequencing of a man who understood that he was running out of time and who spent what was left of it trying to do something that mattered. She thought about what it meant that his last considered act was setting in motion the conditions for a dog to find her. There was something in that, something she couldn't fully articulate, but that she felt in the specific place where she kept the things that had shaped her. Not the big dramatic events, but the small, careful ones. The ones that required sustained effort in the absence of any guarantee. That was what had actually happened here, she thought. Not a single heroic moment, a series of people making sustained choices in the absence of guarantees. Morse with his attorney and his trigger inquiry, Rafferty with his 6-paragraph narrative that he sent into a system he thought he could trust. Kodiak refusing every handler for 7 months because the right person was somewhere and he was going to wait. She'd done it too, in her own way, even without knowing that's what she was doing. She'd stayed in the work. She'd kept showing up. She'd maintained her competence and her care in a unit full of people who deserved both. And she'd done it for 4 years in the quiet that was not peace, but was the closest thing to it she could construct. None of it had been smooth. None of it had been without cost. That was the thing she thought she might need to say out loud someday, when the right moment arrived. That the stories that ended in recognition almost never looked like that from inside them. From inside them, they looked like a long, unglamorous stretch of doing the work, and not knowing if it was going anywhere, punctuated by decisions made fast under pressure with incomplete information. And then one morning, a door opened. At 8 o'clock, she stood up. Kodiak stood up with her. "Okay," she said. He walked beside her to the door. The ceremony happened in the main atrium of Cascade Ridge, which had been cleared of its usual furniture and arranged with chairs by the facilities staff, who had received the request at 6 in the morning and executed it with the specific competence of people who understood that the request mattered without being told why. By 9 o'clock, the atrium had filled in the quiet, organic way that things filled at a hospital. Not an organized arrival, but a gradual accumulation. The veterans unit had come down in 1s and 2s, most of them in their hospital clothes because that was what they had. Some of them walking and some in wheelchairs and one on crutches that he was using with the aggressive independence that characterized everything he did. The hospital staff, nurses, technicians, the day shift coming on and the night shift staying, arranged themselves along the periphery in the unhurried way of people who work in the same building for years and share a particular understanding of it that outsiders don't. Schultz was there. He stood near the back with the contained, careful presence of a man who understood that his role in this room was to witness and not to anchor. He'd left the transfer notice out of the system and confirmed Bold's pulmonary consult and said nothing further that required a response. Felix was at the edge of the room near the main entrance, which was where he spent most of his time and which was appropriate. Rafferty stood to one side with the review board liaison team, Pruitt, Voss, Rains, and two people in uniform that she hadn't met, and behind them, in person, Admiral Patricia Wren, who was a small woman with white hair and the specific physical stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago that presence didn't require size. Kodiak sat at Nora's left heel. She hadn't put him in the evaluation space. She'd considered it and decided against it, because the evaluation period was over and he was where he was supposed to be, which was here. Pruitt spoke first. She was efficient and clear. She outlined the nature of the remediation, the reinstated record, the commendation, the scope of the inquiry without detailing the parts that were still active and classified. She named what had been done to Nora's file and used the specific words, falsification, suppression, unauthorized, without softening them. It was the institutional acknowledgement of a wrong, delivered in institutional language, and it was exactly what it was. Then Admiral Wren stepped forward. She was not a woman who spoke at length when brevity was accurate. What happened to Lieutenant Callahan's record was wrong, she said. It was wrong when it was done, and the fact that it persisted for 7 years made it additionally wrong, because every year is a year in which someone who did something remarkable was officially no one. She paused. We cannot return those years. What we can do is ensure the record is correct, that her name is there, with what she did, for as long as records exist. She looked at Nora directly. The board commends your actions during Operation Keystone Hollow as displaying extraordinary composure and operational judgment under hostile conditions, at personal risk, resulting in the preservation of 3 lives and the maintenance of a defensive position under sustained threat. She paused. We also commend the 4 years of work in this unit, which required a different kind of composure, but not a lesser one. The atrium was quiet. Rafferty stepped forward. I was in uniform. She hadn't seen him in uniform before, and it had a specific effect, not because the uniform conferred anything, it hadn't already been there, but because it made visible a thing that had been there all along. He raised his right hand in a salute. Precise, formal, held. She hadn't expected to feel it the way she felt it. She'd expected something more intellectual, recognition of the gesture's significance, the controlled registering of it as meaningful. What she felt instead was physical, immediate, somewhere in her chest that didn't have a clinical name. She didn't salute back. She was a civilian nurse standing in a hospital atrium. She just looked at him and let the salute be what it was. Then Garrett Odom, from his wheelchair in the second row, brought his right hand up. And Sandra Vieck, standing with her arms crossed in the way she always stood, uncrossed them and raised her hand. And Del Pacheco, who had said maybe 30 words in the past 3 weeks, raised his. And Terrence Bold, who had been brought down in a wheelchair with his oxygen running and who absolutely should have stayed upstairs but who no one had been able to stop, raised his with the careful deliberateness of a man whose arms still pulled from his chest. One by one, the veterans in the room raised their hands. It was not a synchronized moment. It was imperfect and slightly staggered, and one man knocked over the chair beside him and caught it with his other hand without lowering the first. It looked nothing like a ceremony, and exactly like what it was. A group of people who knew something about carrying things invisibly, recognizing someone who had done it too. She kept it together mostly. There was one moment where she didn't, completely. Brief, involuntary, the kind of thing the body did when the pressure of a long compression finally met something that gave it permission to release. She let it happen, and then she put it back. Margaret, who was standing beside her, quietly produced a tissue from somewhere, said nothing, and looked at the ceiling. Admiral Wren stepped forward and placed in Nora's hands the reinstated commendation, physical, official, her name on it in the correct place with the correct date, Rafferty's signature in the recommending officer block. Lieutenant Callahan, she said, the record is correct. Nora held the document. She thought, this is what 7 years weighed. It weighed this. A piece of paper that said she had been somewhere and done something, and that it had happened and mattered and was real. A piece of paper that told the truth about a burned building and 3 people who came out of it, and the arithmetic of a decision made in 11 minutes with incomplete information. The record is correct. She breathed. Thank you, she said. The formal part ended. The informal part, which was what actually mattered in the specific way that the unstructured aftermath of significant events always mattered more than the structured part, began with Margaret producing coffee from somewhere and the hospital's cafeteria staff arriving with trays of food that was, by the standards of hospital cafeteria food, genuinely decent, which told her that someone had made a specific request rather than leaving it to default. The atrium did what it did with people in it. The clusters formed and reformed. Conversations happened that had the texture of things that needed to be said and were finally finding their moment. Rafferty talked to Del Pacheco for 20 minutes in the corner, and she didn't know what they said, but Pacheco was nodding and his shoulders had a different quality than they'd had when he arrived. Terence Bold had been moved to a chair near the coffee table, oxygen still running, and was holding court with the specific energy of a man who had narrowly avoided a serious medical event and was using the proximity to it as fuel. She caught it, he was telling 2 nurses she didn't know well. 20 minutes in, I thought it was reflux. She caught it in about 30 seconds. 45, she said, passing behind him. You see what she does? He said to the nurses, gesturing at her. Corrects me in front of everyone. That's care right there. She kept moving. Garrett found her near the window. He had his coffee and the expression of a man who had several things he wanted to say and was selecting between them. You could have told us, he said eventually. I didn't know it would go anywhere, she said, and I wasn't sure I wanted it to. 4 years, Nora. I know. He was quiet for a moment. My first deployment, I had a CO who told me that the best people in the room were always the ones you stopped noticing because they just kept making things work. He looked at his coffee. I thought he was talking about logistics. He meant people. He looked up at her. I stopped noticing you. Garrett, I'm saying I'm sorry for that. She looked at him. This man who had been difficult and perceptive and real in equal measure for 6 weeks, who had shown up in her hallway with 3 other veterans on the day she'd most needed to know they saw her. You showed up, she said, when it mattered. Could have shown up earlier. Most people show up late, she said. The ones who show up at all are the ones that count. He held his coffee cup toward her in a gesture that was not quite a toast, but was adjacent to one. She touched the edge of her cup to his. Kodiak was at her left side. He had been there throughout, patient, present, unbothered by the noise and the number of people in a way that would have been unthinkable 2 weeks ago. She'd watched him over the course of the morning, and what she saw was not the resolution of his grief, but the accommodation of it. He still felt Morse's absence. She could tell in the way he sometimes oriented to a sound or a movement that wasn't there, a reflexive check for someone who was gone. He would probably always do that. Some things didn't resolve, they just became integrated, and the integration was its own kind of peace. She understood that. At 11, Admiral Wren found her near the edge of the atrium. The inquiry is going to move faster than I expected, Wren said. She had the directness of someone who didn't have time for cushioning and didn't apologize for it. Fawcett's resignation has complicated his position. It looks like flight rather than cooperation, and the board intends to treat it accordingly. Good, Nora said. There are going to be additional calls on your time, more statements, more cooperation requests. The 7 other files, those people deserve what you have now, and building that case takes time and witnesses. She paused. I want to be direct about what I'm asking. You're asking if I'll keep cooperating. Yes. Yes, Nora said. Wren looked at her for a moment with the specific attention of someone who has assessed a great many people in a great many situations and has developed a calibrated sense of where the reliable ones were. You're staying here? At this hospital? I'm staying. The board can offer you a civilian consulting role. It wouldn't require leaving your position here, but it would formalize your cooperation and give you access to the board's resources as the inquiry develops. She paused. It's not a promotion. It's not glamorous. It's paperwork and phone calls and occasional travel. When do I start? Wren almost smiled. It was small and brief. Monday. She left. Nora stood at the edge of the atrium and looked at the room, the people in it, the coffee, the staggered salutes that had happened an hour ago and that she was still carrying the specific weight of. She thought about the version of herself that had walked through the main entrance of Cascade Ridge 4 years ago with a gap in her employment history and a determination to take up as little space as possible. She'd thought that was wisdom. She'd thought that smallness was the same as safety. It wasn't. It was just smallness. What she'd learned, slowly, through the accumulation of specific and unglamorous evidence, was that the people who needed her most weren't asking for her past. They weren't asking for the classified file or the operational record or the burned building. They were asking for what she brought to a room on any given Tuesday: the attention, the competence, the specific and unsentimental care that came from a person who had seen enough to understand what mattered. Her past had never stopped being true. It had just been invisible. It wasn't invisible anymore. She went to find Rafferty, who was standing near the door with his coffee and the look of a man who was giving himself a moment before moving on to whatever came next. "The consulting role," she said. He looked at her. "Ren offered it." I said yes. He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's going to be a lot of work." "I know. You're going to keep the nursing job." "The consulting role is remote mostly, and I'm not leaving this unit." She looked at the room, at Garrett and Terrence and Sandra and Dell, at Margaret refilling coffee with the efficiency of someone who considered logistics a form of care, at Felix near the door doing his job. "These are my patients," Rafferty nodded slowly. "What about Kodiak?" he said. She looked down at the dog. He looked up at her. The transfer paperwork was technically still pending. The original 2-week evaluation had been interrupted by everything that had followed, and the formal decision had never been completed. She could, technically, return him to Rafferty. He could, technically, try another placement. "The transfer is complete," she said. "He stays." Rafferty looked at the dog for a moment. Something in his expression was complicated in the way that things were complicated when they were both a loss and a rightness simultaneously. "He'd have kept looking," Rafferty said. "You know that. If it hadn't been here, he'd have kept going." "I know. Morse knew that too." She looked at Rafferty. "That's why it worked." He nodded. He understood. They stood in the doorway of the atrium for a moment. The room behind them, the hospital corridor ahead, the ordinary and extraordinary occupying the same space the way they always did. "Where are you going now?" he asked. "Third floor," she said. "I have charts." He laughed. It was a short, genuine sound. The laugh of someone who had been through something real and come out the other side and found that the other side still had charts in it. "I'll walk you up," he said. She shook her head. "Go home. Come back Tuesday. Bring better coffee than the cafeteria." "That's a low bar." "Manage it anyway." He went. She turned toward the elevator with Kodiak beside her. In the elevator, on the way to the third floor, she stood in the small metal box with the institutional light and the faint hum of the mechanism and let herself be still for a moment, not processing, not planning, not calculating the next thing, just standing. The elevator opened on 3. The unit was doing what it did. Patrick Osei was updating something at the nurses' station. The hallway had its usual sound texture, the soft machinery, the distant voices, the specific ambient of a place where people were working hard at staying alive or helping others do it. Nora Callahan walked out of the elevator and back into it, not as the woman who took up as little space as possible, not as the person whose name wasn't in any record worth reading, not as the nurse everyone had stopped noticing until a dog refused to, just as herself. Finally, and in full, Kodiak walked beside her, not performing, not orienting, not searching anymore. Just present, just here. Some things took 7 years to arrive. Some things required a burned building and a suppressed file and a dead man's final careful act and a dog with a long memory. Some things were worth all of it. She picked up the first chart.